is worsening with every passing cycle. The nuclear strike on the planet's surface has decimated much of the civilian populace, and what little remains of use and authority is stranded behind an orbital blockade held up by the Imperial fleet. Is that correct?
That is the unfortunate reality, yes.
So, as a representative of Aeon then, a party affiliated with the Yuuzhan government, you confirm that the situation is dire?
Dire, yes, but we have been here before. Adversity does nothing but embolden the people of the nation, Gestalt and Replica alike.
The military presence on Veneta is predominantly made up of replica divisions, yes?
As per standard operational procedure, yes.
There are concerns among the populace that an overt dependency on the replica frame is becoming a crutch of sorts, a potential weakness in the stability of the war effort.
Imperial propaganda. Imperial propaganda, no doubt. The replica is our most robust technological innovation that has only augmented and furthered our society. A perfect fusion of Gestalt anatomy with the resilience of the machine that allows for the proliferation of loyal workers and courageous soldiers who will defend our way of life. We have already lost so much defending.
So, amidst concerns of stagnating technological development,
there are no reports of stagnation. This is nothing but hearsay and locker room talk by those who are susceptible to improper thoughts. The replica is a new frontier of possibilities that will give all of us the future we deserve. The replica sets an example for all citizens who bleed Yuuzhan blood. That is only with complete trust in the nation's path that we will succeed together. The replica is, and always will be, infallible.
Hello again. Please, do not acknowledge the runtime of this video at any point. This is an extremely brief, extremely succinct, extremely concise creation, and it has not absorbed worrying amounts of my time. Today's topic, self-abuse, self-hatred, turning the blade of despair on yourself. Ignore what the psychiatrists tell you. It's normal to hate yourself. It makes you a Chad. It makes you a man. Mental health professionals seek to tell you otherwise so they can force you to try their depraved alternative fashion. With the invention of the internet, which non-consensually binds the worst of humanity together in a hellish international forum of idiocy, impulse, and insanity, there have never been more ways to act on your lack of self-esteem, like video games. What better way to hate yourself than betting all your life savings on getting a hotted Garnu? The liberal left hate this because, God forbid, a man has a hobby nowadays. I myself am no meager masochist. I frequent many a game like XCOM and Darkest Dungeon and Battle Brothers that will align the worst possible numbers to completely destroy me on the whim of chance.
The game is like twisted my dick in 20 different angles.
I hate myself on a competitive level. My very atoms shake with such fierce self-loathing. I make the funny guy from Disco Elysium look like fucking Mr. Rogers. But one day, I'm scrolling Twitter, another act of self-hatred made possible by the World Wide Web, and stumble across a peculiar animation by a rainy dancer on Twitter. Like many red-blooded true gamers, I discover new media through a particular gateway. Images of a certain seedy quality. A lot of these animations are actually cutesy and wholesome, supplemented by fan art pieces of characters in a variety of heartwarming situations, and videos radiating potent crackhead energy. If this game's community could be likened to a door, it would be one of a hingeless nature. You, a filthy layperson, may be charmed by this display, but big-time sufferers like me are not fooled so easily. Chances are, when you see a large volume of fan creation in which a game's characters are being happy and carefree and silly, this isn't a celebration of the game's actual narrative contents, but instead, a trauma response. I knew at a mere glance that this game was going to make me want to relinquish life. But I was ready. Adversity was all too familiar, so I sat down, booted up the game, and set forth on this adventure that would take me 13 hours total. Imagine my surprise when I awoke a whole month later covered in blood, piss, and spit.
Oh, where's my dick at?
All of my free time has been swallowed whole by this monster. Every waking moment I spend appeasing the obsession embedded at the core of who I am, forsaking free time and social relationships in favour of an artistic pursuit of which there can be no cathartic conclusion. I spent 12 straight hours painting this. I didn't eat anything. I stopped playing games at all. Okay, apart from that one, but that's just regular self-abuse. Ever since I have beaten a game, I have repeatedly, without fail, been asked by all my work colleagues and family members if I am okay. When they ask me as to the condition of my mental health, in my head I want to say, of course I'm not alright, you fucking idiot. But what I actually ended up saying was, you bumbling fuckhead, no, I am not okay. I walked deep into the mouths of hell, inured against the warning signs by pride and arrogance, and I am now suffering for it in the worst way possible. The fucking sanity that tethers me to the responsibilities and demands of reality has been completely fucking ousted by a bunch of fucking robot lesbians! So how did we get here? What happened to me? What instigated this violent manic episode that's eclipsed my life? What did SIGNALIS, this isometric survival horror game, do to me? This interactive media that sends the player through an ever-worsening derelict facility to fulfill a promise you hardly remember. SIGNALIS presents a story in a deliberately bizarre and almost nonsensical manner, akin to an endless and inescapable dream. A nightmare that takes place within the sprawling dominion of a ruthlessly authoritarian galactic regime. It was after a month of self-destruction manifesting as terminal brain rot, nay, cranial deterioration, that I realized what I had to do. I had to make a video talking about this through the lens of something I had been fascinated with since I was a kid. Writing. The foundational element of media that I think most people, especially now, forget the importance of. So, sit back, juice up with a sweet relief of an auto-injector, and struggle to find yourself in a galaxy that deplores the individual, because I'm about to explain why SIGNALIS ruined my life. But let's get something clear. I'm not doing this for you. You, despite all your wondrous support on the last video, play zero part in my conviction. Whether I get 1 view or 1 million views, whether my sanity's sacrifice is known by many or known by none, you are not the motivation. This upload's true purpose is self-preservation, because if I go another second without some form of release, some manner of closure, I am going to seriously fucking kill myself. Rose Engine's first foray into game development was not with SIGNALIS. The two developers that comprise the indie studio, Barbara Whitman and Yuri Stern, going by the pseudonyms Replicant and Anti-Helios, have tried their hand at game development before with 2 projects of far smaller scope. The first was Coffin Counseling, a light-hearted platformer where you played as a bad therapist having to counsel a castle of creepy monsters with all sorts of personal issues, and, eventually, the big guy himself. The second was Ascend, a short platformer where you scale a haphazardous tower to then crawl out from your grave. It's here you can see the origins of what would become SIGNALIS' art style. Considering these two have gone from short platformers to a several-hour-long survival horror game is an extremely impressive feat, especially when you think about how much work has to go into the latter. Do you know why so many new devs flock to horror games as their first project? It's a genre that demands little of them from a game design standpoint. You can make a game that's incredibly linear, where encounters against an adversary are tantamount scripted, where it all boils down to a leisurely stroll through your local haunted house, and that will be substantive. Perhaps not amazing, but certainly enough for people to play. Instead, greater focus can be put into aspects of presentation where you don't have to account for the million different ways players may find to exploit your game system. Art and music, staging and framing, all of this creates ambience and atmosphere that can make something as simple as holding W a more frightening task. There is simply no better starting point for a budding dev yearning to familiarize themselves with programs and game design overall, because it has a very limited drain on their sanity. Imagine asking a guy fresh to the industry to program a satisfying equivalent to something like XCOM. Not just anyone can design Viper breasts. That is a sacred duty. But survival horror, comparatively, is way harder. The survival part of the game relies on established rules and conventions for the player to work with. Resource management is a major component, meaning a prospective game designer now needs to account for the abundance of items, how the player is able to obtain them, and deduce whether it should be easier or more difficult to do so. Exactly what items and what needs they satisfy need to be dreamed up too. On top of that, you now need to think about the challenges of the adversaries, how many there will be, how easy they will be to circumvent or outright kill, the way they behave and interact with the player. Taking one step to the right moves you from ambient walking simulator into whatever the hell this is. But it's not a simulation game. There's onus on the horror too. You need an aesthetic, a comprehensive and competent design for music and art that sets a consistent theme aligning with the menacing nature of the game, a setting that adds context to the player's misfortune, or even a story to follow along. These feed into each other. Ambience and atmosphere cultivate tension, a nauseating fear at the thought of what terrible demise awaits the plucky protagonist, which then motivates the player to do everything they can to avoid such a fate by staying on top of their resource management. This drives them to engage more with the game, which in turn exposes them more to the presentation that unnerves them further. It's an unending cycle of two aspects, both unquestionably consequential, that serve to keep the gamer on the edge of their seat and their avid stream viewers always entertained. So Rose Engine taking these design demands to task for Signalis' development was an impressive and admirable goal. However, I found how it played to be the weakest aspect. Just coming off the back end of Darkwood, it felt almost too easy. Enemies on their own could easily get their ankles Cory Kenshin'd. Bosses were laughably incapable of deciding on whether they wanted to kill me, and it came together as a source of weak adversity that failed to bring me my demise even once. On normal difficulty, I never lost. It was only after writing this section I realised the potential clout I could cash in. There was a harder difficulty called Survival, less available ammo and utility, enemies that hit harder and needed more to be taken down. If I wished to render my status as a god gamer unquestionable, surely all I needed to do was ace this challenge without dying. It was only after I turned on the hardest difficulty that I realised what I had been missing out on. Survival mode, in my opinion, is the quintessential gameplay difficulty for Signalis. It recontextualizes everything. Being able to run around enemies isn't an unintended flaw, it's an intended choice. In a mode where ammo is scarce, combat against every enemy isn't wise, nor is it optimal. Sneaking around them and beating a retreat if they see you is sometimes the better option. Of course, breaking their ankles with sharp evasive maneuvers is always tactically sound and really fucking cool. You best be swift, because otherwise you'll get dropped just as swiftly. Towards the end of the game, shield-bearing androids and taser-wielding fiends can kill you in 2 to 3 hits. Even a regular cannon fodder can leave you slain if caught unaware. Everything is far more tense as a result, and the consequences of carelessness become especially troublesome. A novel feature of Signalis is enemies, once defeated, will eventually get back up. If you sprint near them or stray too close, they'll awaken and resume their charitable donation of grievous injury. Considering enemies take much more damage to be killed, it means they are a greater drain on the resources you need to progress. The game also requires the player to complete puzzles and obtain specific items to clear areas and advance into the facility. People have gripes of the game's limited inventory, but after some time, I came to love it. This imposed small space to carry items makes it so you have to actually consider and plan your movements ahead of time. If you don't, you'll have to backtrack often, which means you run the risk of reawakening foes you already spent enough ammo trying to put down in the first place. The game also gives you access to a scarce number of thermite flares that can be used to ensure enemies stay dead permanently. Their very low numbers, however, makes it so the player has to make careful choices about where to use it. It's best to secure commonly frequented routes and fight enemies in places where their corpses will be out of the way so they can't reanimate when you pass them. SIGNALIS always leaves you wanting for something, and that is an important aspect only realised in survival mode. You're never truly comfortable, never secure, and always concerned that using utility in the present confrontation will leave you in a bad position for future fights. But combat and circumventing the enemy are not the only challenges you get presented with. What I was foolish to miss in my first draft of the gameplay was the map as part of the difficulty. It's a very useful tool to help plan where you need to go and make the most of your visits to areas so you minimise the chance of waking up downed foes. Halfway through the game, however, during the most difficult section known as Nowhere, it gets taken away from you. Entering rooms on one side will spit you out on the opposite. This shifting perspective and deprivation of digital cartography makes simply navigating your surroundings harder and forces the player to rely upon their own memory and cunning to move efficiently through the area, all the while the enemies are only getting more lethal and resilient. The landscape is something the players have to contend with, especially in the final area, where avenues start getting blocked as you progress, so you're funneled into areas that potentially are saturated with enemies. The puzzles you're hurrying around to complete are actual puzzles. Typically, survival horror games give you infinite playsets to solve out of fear players will get left behind, typically finding a code somewhere and that being a solution to open a locker or door. SIGNALIS starts out similar, simply finding a note that then explains what code is needed for the safe with a keycard, but this is intended to be simple. It's the tutorial. Later on you're given logic puzzles, minigames that demand more of your sound gamer mind. It was extremely gratifying to abstain from using a walkthrough and make a sincere effort to solve them on my own. Solving the breaker puzzle delivered profound euphoria on my soul. The fact the game starts and you immediately take control of the protagonist and get to play is amazing. It's so refreshing to see during an era where games frequently spend ages before really allowing the player to play. SIGNALIS' tutorialized so well, yet directly to the player says very little. It does that cute thing where video game controls are explained as if they're natural occurrences in the world. I love when games do that, and that alone is enough to carry a player's understanding. It teaches combat in a good manner also. The moment you're given a gun, you're presented with a weak enemy that slowly shambles towards you, so you have an opportunity to familiarize yourself with your primary tool of ballistic diplomacy. Once you descend from this zone, you're on your own, and the game no longer seeks to guide you. For their first survival horror game, for their first attempt at this balancing act of robust design and deliberate ambient direction, Rose Engine created an impressively solid foundation for this gameplay loop of finding and using resources. Despite this world-altering revelation as a consequence of my second playthrough, a few things stood out to me that barred SIGNALIS from clawing its way further up the ladder of certified quality. While I will best any man in armed combat to defend the honour of the inventory system, I am beset with uncontrollable hatred at the thought of the offhand system. Being unable to use my disposable seizure device or have my EpiPen ready in the dark feels like an unfair contrivance, but I'm forced to use the flashlight that really should just be bound to a hotkey with zero gameplay implications. I still feel scorned that I died here and had to replay 20 minutes of the prior area because I was spamming C thinking I was about to subject this fiend to the concept of an electric current, when, in reality, I repeatedly flashed my light in their face to the tune of Caramel Dancin'. And listen, Rose Engine, I get it. You put a lot of work into the inventory screen. This is the first time I have ever carnally desired a menu. That being said, I also believe it should be better advertised that SIGNALIS is a turn-based RPG, because when ammo is scarce, and it frequently is, I have to repeatedly open the inventory to cycle between my weapons after firing a single round each. It can be sobering to realize, during encounters, I am spending more time in the menu than in the actual encounter. Being able to scroll wheel between the weapons in my inventory would have been a neat addition that keeps me engrossed in the moment, instead of giving myself epilepsy with how often I'm opening the inventory and freezing time to turn on the radio.
I'm over here stroking my dick, I got lotion on my dick right now.
I also feel like the game wouldn't be hurt for a bit more variety in the enemy types. Whilst there are different enemies, such as the Borzoi you encounter towards the end of the game, they all only have implications for short-range melee encounters with varying degrees of damage dealt. You're still playing the same style of keep away. Ranged adversaries, like the minor mini-boss, do force you to stay mobile to avoid getting blasted, but unfortunately you only encounter this foe thrice throughout the entire game, and in all confrontations they seem more committed to their impressive feats of projectile vomiting than putting 2 pounds of pressure on a trigger. One of the Rainy Dance's animations features a corrupted android shooting at our protagonist with a revolver, and it makes me yearn for some encounters where you would have to duke it out with a foe that boasts the same ballistic lethality as you. It would surely be far more of a challenge than the ARAR units whose spawns can be reset by leaving the room and walking back in. Perhaps they believe I am covering the facility's repair costs and are attempting to drain my funds by repeatedly ruining the floor. Whatever foolish plan they believe in, they're an embarrassment. Get them out of my sight. But in summary, Signalis is a pretty good survival horror game, just shy of astoundingly impressive. It is tense, it demands something of you, and it isn't afraid to punish your failings. But why have I just wasted your time talking about Signalis through the lens of its play? As stated before, my focus is on how the underpinning foundation of writing and storytelling serves to make Signalis such a potent creative entity. What was the necessity of this section? Well, I brought it up for good reason. Signalis has been designed as a game, as a piece of interactive media that makes room for player agency, but some may see it as partially a failure. If the component that tethers it to the medium of video games is the weakest, if it's only truly worth one's time for its linear aspects of narrative and visual presentation, surely it can't be that good of a game. That it would be better off as a book or a film where they can retain those advantages. This is a reasonable perspective at first glance, one that genuinely did make me question how I felt on Signalis as a game specifically, instead of a general result of creative endeavour. That got me thinking, dear viewer, and that is a dangerous happening. Gabriel Zevin's book, Tomorrow Cubed, is a recent literary foray of mine that has left me emotionally destitute. Got a bit of a running theme going on, I'm unsure if you've noticed. The story focuses upon the lives of two university students and old friends, Sadie Green and Sam Mazer, both of which reunite in the pursuit of making it big as game designers. It's a powerfully written tale of life, a self-proclaimed story of love, yet not of romance. It talks about games through a lens not of casual enjoyment, but as pieces of art in complex expression that double as fun interactive experiences, which is rare for media covering games, as they typically opt into the insufferable referential nature of Ready Player One, soy-facing at video game characters to hide the shame of their reality. The way it's written is almost like a verbalized recounting of the characters' lives, which, admittedly, took me a little to get used to. It can sometimes be quite sparing on the description, meaning some moments, like a haunting conversation with a dying woman after she threw herself off a building, become awkwardly normal conversations.
Hey Ryan. Hey Billy.
But why am I bringing up this great book? Is the illusion of literacy that important to me, so my audience doesn't realise I stole this entire script and sends a balding 30-year-old man to come to my house and charitably offer to credit me in my own obituary? In actuality, it's because of a small game in the book called The Solution. This hypothetical game is similar to Tetris, where you put parts together to earn point scores, attaining greater ranks for the faster you manage to complete them. Sounds kind of boring, right? There's not even any anime gacha in there. Well, what's interesting is you can pay for info on the factory with some of your points, which will reduce your score and negatively affect your performance. The best players will ignore this and complete the tasks, rewarding them with the rank of good little Austrian subordinate. Uh-oh. Those little widgets you made were, in fact, tank parts for a fleet of armoured divisions expanding Germany's control of Europe. If a player asks for information, they come to understand over time they are working in a tank factory for the funky little Austrian, and, with that, can choose how to hamper their own productivity. This is actually inspired by Brenda Ramiro's 2009 board game called Train, where players have to get their train to the finish line first, where it's then revealed the train was ferrying prisoners to a concentration camp. It's similar down to the response. Sadie Green has a classmate attempt to have her expelled from the university, a parallel to how Ramiro received threats following the game's debut. And I bring this up for a specific reason. Games are built upon established rules and boundaries of interactivity that construct an interactive experience, with different arrangements and features categorizing them into all manner of genre and subgenre. This forms a proverbial bone structure, the gamer backbone if you will, but it is arguably a product of heavy derivatives. Games have been around for a while, and while they have got prettier and fancier, core components still remain similar if not the same as predecessors. This comes down to things as fundamental as conventions for control schemes. The R key is to reload, the space key is to jump, the shift key is to sprint, and if you dare trifle with such established traditions, then you ought to be subjected to pure, unadulterated agony. When you apply to something like Signalis and survival horror games, there are similar conventions: limited inventory systems, non-regenerating pool of health, predominant focus on melee enemies for greater sense of impending doom, all supplemented by a set of puzzles. There's nothing wrong with this. Entrenched rules for how games ought to control and play are a natural product of an aging and improving industry, where bad ideas have been screwed out and better ones have been determined. But if all future iterations of interactive media seek to emulate the same core components, then what are we opting to play? Is Signalis much different to a game like Resident Evil, when both of them are just dramatic reenactments of American police sentiments towards falling acorns? It is. Why? Because of story. Story serves to provide context as to why the player is carrying out the actions in the game. This qualitative addition to something thoroughly quantitative redefines what would otherwise be a package of arranged derivatives. It differentiates from others on the quality of the tale it's telling and the subtler meaning behind it. In the same way Solution and Train contextualize the mundane shape arrangement as a contribution to humanitarian disaster, Signalis turns aimless android massacre into one desperate clawing at purpose and meaning. The story it's telling directly and indirectly through environment and more upfront means is what motivates players to not just keep going, but engage at all with what they're playing. Take a game like Project Zomboid. It's famed for overwhelming complexity, where you can micromanage your caloric intake during a zombie apocalypse, but it's not just this abundance of systems that substantiates your investment. You come to care about your player character and the emergent storytelling of your imminent demise, the near brushes with death, and the numerous exploits of your survivalist nightmare. That's something that can only be achieved on the merit of it being a game. Books and movies treat you as the passive observer, someone seeing the tale through the eyes of a protagonist and fostering affection or hatred towards them. But in a video game, you are playing as or are the protagonist. These actions are yours, and that changes their meaning. Would Train or Solution have even mattered if, instead of it being the player unknowingly carrying out dreadful deeds, it was a surrogate doing so because it was written that way? Soma could not have been nearly as affecting if told through non-interactive means, one of the best pieces of sci-fi transhumanist media on the planet, and, if I haven't struck this dead horse with enough velocity yet, that game for most people was pretty much just a walking simulator. Now, of course, you have to buy into engaging with the story at all through the gameplay itself. People only ever got to be told they were a Hearts of Iron player because Train and Solution were enjoyable enough to play. If a game isn't well made, one's investment and willingness to entertain the narrative can be wholly compromised no matter how good the tale being spun is. It is a game, after all. And that's why Signalis can only ever really work that way. Where movies and books have to be more direct to guide a passive audience's gaze, a game like Signalis provides for audience agency that involves them further in the story through desperate bouts of combat and circumventing confrontation. It's the fact the player controls the protagonist that makes it so involving, in stark contrast to how movies and books relinquish control to the whim of the writer. Because Signalis is a solid, reliable, and consistent game, it is able to act as the gateway for people to be so affected by its story. To be affected by the underpinning element of games, if not all media. It takes something as common as a button press and turns it into something greater. Signalis may not be the best survival horror game in terms of play, but on this principle of narrative recontextualization, it is the veritable exemplar of storytelling in video games. Why? Well, dear viewer, it's time I introduce you to a little term called diegesis. I have played a few survival horror games during my many years of existence. My affinity for gaming, my talent in virtual distractions that have zero bearing on reality, have familiarized me with this wonky narrative structure that has fostered much affection. The diegesis. For those of you unfamiliar, diegesis, as explained by the Australian book avian Cloud Cuckoo Country in their video on narrators, simply refers to the story world of a fiction. The premise of many survival horror games embodies a diegetic approach that best involves the player in the story and, based on my earlier spiel, better hooks them into the ongoing events of the narrative. Outlast is... okay, I can't bring up Outlast every single video, let's just Google something. Oh sweet, here we go. Corpse Party Repeated Fear is an RPG Maker survival horror game that made the rounds on YouTube during 2013, played by many a sizable YouTuber like Cinnamon Toast Ken, PewDiePie, and The Predator. It's the most popular installment in the series of many failed spin-offs, reboots, and sequels where a cohort of students gets transported to a haunted, derelict elementary school and have to desperately find a way to escape as murderous ghosts, crazed killers, and the gnawing decay of time passing assail them at every turn. Gameplay involves solving puzzles and avoiding enemies to advance the story towards your eventual escape. Personally, I found it to be an enjoyable watch on YouTube, despite its enthusiasm to flaunt some of the, Yandere dev, is that you? What sticks out more to well-adjusted sane human beings, in lieu of such disgusting perversion, is the premise. Arriving in a new environment completely unforeseen and unrecognizable, having to navigate the uncharted treacheries in hopes of making it out alive. This trope of arriving at a derelict facility you've never seen before and getting stranded there is surprisingly common. Alien Isolation Sevastopol, Resident Evil 7's Baker Residence, Darkwoods Forests, Soma's Paphos 2. These are all games with a premise involving you arriving to a previously unseen location and exploring it. SIGNALIS doesn't divert from this trope. Your eldritch lesbian adventure takes you through the abandoned corridors of a Sierpinski 23 mining facility, arriving just after a terrible disease has killed all of the human workers, known as gestalt, and left the androids, known as replicas, in feral and violent states. This common premise is of note to me because of its diegetic nature. What makes this common trope of premise for survival horror so interesting is that you are uncovering information about the world and how it got into such a ruined state as the player character themselves comes to uncover it in the story. Our protagonist, known as Elster, doesn't actually know much about where they are, and when other replicas insist that they remember her, she doesn't recall. At this point in the story, neither do you. It turns the unfamiliarity of a world inherent to what comes with a new game into a component of SIGNALIS' diegesis. It encourages a player to explore and examine things, making use of the inspect function in the inventory to obtain information about the alien environment they've woken up in. The intrigue of the player, arguably, is a central component of the plot's locomotion, because it is ultimately a vicarious experience of Elster's desires to understand more about the world and, on top of that, deliver on the vague details of a phantom promise. This also compounds why SIGNALIS does work as a game and not as a book or film. Where books or films would have to explain things more directly, have Elster investigate items in a scripted manner to keep the audience up to speed, a game can instead relegate key information to cutscenes and story beats, while leaving the rest scattered around for the player to find if they so wish to. That agency in understanding how Sierpinski 23 was ruined, in deciphering where you are and what you're even doing there, which directly rewards and also fuels your insatiable intrigue, works greater to involve the player in Elster's story than it would otherwise. The interactivity is crucial to SIGNALIS, the interactivity beholden only to this medium, and thusly qualifies it as a piece of art that works well as a survival horror video game. With qualms as to the appropriateness of SIGNALIS' classification as a game summarily subdued, we can finally look at how, beyond the realm of play, it works through the devices of a story to ensnare and ruin the lives of its players. According to some people, God built the world in 7 days. Everyone needs a hobby, and for them, laying the foundation for existence to flourish was just a casual pursuit after the grind of a 9-to-5 work schedule. Perhaps if they'd spent more time on it, it wouldn't be so shit. While the world simultaneously burns and floods, people who so openly despise the common man reign from the highest pillars of power to ensure the interests of them and their wealthy pals remain top priority. All the while, the next generation of illiterate children, every iota of creativity, imagination, and critical thought singed off their brains by unending streams of TikTok videos and YouTube shorts, are mindlessly regurgitating manufactured lies that a man once called Andy, now being a woman called Rebecca, is the reason the economy is tanking. I guess that's just another thing transgender women have an unfair biological advantage in. Macroeconomics. Sorry, my bad. Perhaps I got a little too political. You're not here to be reminded of a societal death spiral. You're here to listen to a British man pretend to be a dog and talk to you about a piece of media. You're here to escape. Well, dear viewer, where better to escape than a fictional world of your own creation. World building is the act of, as the name suggests, building worlds. Constructing an entire universe from nothing but ideas, concepts, and devilish notions all conjured up in one's head. It's typically employed in genres like fantasy and sci-fi, where fantastical technology and magical phenomena need to have a believable point of origin. World building is an opportunity for a writer, or any creator for that matter, to envision so many interesting things about their hypothetical world on a large and small scale. Large scale would denote aspects like international relations between countries, the landmass and its geography, the political climate of a world, and fundamental elements such as what races roam the land. For the world in my books, Vostrema, it's animal people. Because I'm cringe, but that's not all. You have smaller scale aspects of a world pertinent to individual countries like languages, cultures, fashion, cuisines, political systems, religions and national holidays, currency, economy, exports, imports, tourism, military might and population. You then even have smaller aspects specific to certain regions like dialect, local traditions, crime rates, fauna and flora, local government structure, social climate, religious sects, and what sort of food is available. You then have even smaller. The dead horse has been thoroughly beaten enough. World building is crucial. To construct an existence that feels lived in, that feels real enough for life to have existed before the moment the story takes place, is a matter of attention to detail and love for what you're making. But it's also a matter of restraint. Endless world building, while cathartic, is not a story. You see, when telling a story through a book or film, the runtime or page count is shared. The span of the experience is finite. Key information about the plot, but also about the world it's taking place in, has to be conveyed without one stepping on the toes of the other. This means some aspects of world building are to be left completely unexplored, which can be difficult to discern what's expendable and what isn't, because it's aspects of the wider world which, on the basis of its size, is generally irrelevant to the story of our own lives. Not to mention that this poses a bit of a conundrum, because including aspects of world building purely for the locomotion of the plot is arguably its antithesis. The world doesn't exist for the story. Its existence isn't purely functional, and to treat it that way is to neglect what makes for a good tale. A story occurring within a world that can be shaped by it, but ultimately will carry on regardless. So how do you manage to make an authentic surrounding setting that makes the necessary concessions to allow a complete story to begin, continue, and conclude to the audience's satisfaction? Signalis, as a survival horror game, doesn't need to make those sacrifices. Signalis' design encourages the player to explore their surroundings, follow winding paths to their inevitable end, and to rid dank dwellings of their fetid occupants. As the player explores, they will stumble across pieces of information left behind in the aftermath. Because it's a game, and not something less interactive, Signalis' design accounts for the initiative of the player, and is able to leave information about Elster's whereabouts and the larger world readily available, without detracting focus from delving deeper and deeper into the facility in pursuit of an unknown Gestalt woman. Ample opportunity is provided to piece together the universe of Signalis in the form of government documents, classified intelligence, or memoirs. It's not exactly novel, but what they depict can certainly be described that way. A lot of entries detail the events and happenings of the days leading to S23's collapse, namely how the disease that corrupted replicas and killed Gestalts made its way through the facility upon a discovery being made at the bottom of the mines. This provides insight as to the culprit behind the collapse, but also the lack of information on the events of the collapse itself are equally as illuminating. S23 was overwhelmed so fast, no one had the time to write about it. They could see what was coming, but evidently, it was far closer than they anticipated. That is a really cool detail. These notes and documents also talk of a galaxy beyond the desolate snowy moon and the current conflict it is embroiled in between the nation and the Empire, both once being united as Yusan, but having splintered following a civil war that left the ruling empress slain. The war is still ongoing, with Veneta being the latest front in the continuing affair, another planet left submerged beneath the ocean by nuclear barrages. Information on how the fleets in the orbit of nearby planets are blockading starving citizens and stranded ground forces, and how they will continue, shows that the war is far from over. Elster's happenings in S23 are not a pressing matter to the nation, an entity depicted as a horrible authoritarian parallel to the East German dictatorship of the Cold War that champions the well-being of the collective even when it comes at the detriment of the individual. The crude and brutalist industrial constructions, this world of ceaseless maddening concrete, speaks to the nature and unspoken philosophies of the nation. It's a government focused on labour, on tireless work, to further innovate and prosper. Its people are a means to a glorious end, established by the abundance of rusted holding cells and a bloodied interrogation chamber that would make even the authoritarian state of America blush with glee. The documents expand on the specifics of their dogmatic policies, such as forbidding the use of certain words that are perceived to oppose ideological tenets, or the rule of 6, where citizens are not permitted access to more than 6 items at a time. In short, they have a limited inventory. The crazy bastards made your limited inventory system part of a diegesis. An item of greater fascination, however, is not the facility itself, but instead the cadre of robot women that inhabit it. Many are rabid lesbian fawns over this cutting-edge Yuri technology, and for good reason. Me? I do not partake. I'm a good ally, and thusly, I shall let the lesbians feast. I have my wife back in Darkest Dungeon, and that's all I need.
How many times have I said, I want a woman that could crush my head in between her thighs?
We must move cautiously, my infatuated siblings, because the CIA assassinated my boy Joe-Cat for liking women a little too much. Never underestimate the internet's ability to dox you, send you death threats, and call you a groomer over an innocuous 30-second video of you being attracted to the opposite sex. Back on topic, these replicas are produced following the collapse of the Empire. Replicas are proud servants of the nation employed for a variety of functions such as general labor and military service. As an industrious and scientific entity, the replica and its different models are the nation's crowning achievement. The different models, in summary: Eula, bottom; Ara, nerd; Calibri, horrendously homosexual; Star, a crayon-eating marine; Ura, staunch; Oops, all legs; Falk, girl boss; Elster, down horrendous; and Adler, the only discernibly male replica, known as Germa. The conception of the Adler is the in-universe postulation of being in a world where heterosexuality was the minority. Jokes aside, the replica is a very interesting aspect of this constructed universe. It's likely following the costly revolution that overthrew the Empire, many human people died, and led to a dire demand for workers in reconstruction. Being able to mass-produce the equivalent of human labourers who don't have as many needs to satisfy would compensate tremendously and put the nation in an advantageous position for war with the remnants of the Empire. It also fits the ethos of a nation very well and implicitly states their view on the value of not just replicas, but also gestalt. Replicas such as stars and storches are used as security enforcers, those responsible for upholding government authority and administering necessary punishment, so they're in a higher position of importance than the average worker. However, you can find written instructions on the decommission process for replicas that specify how bullets are the preferred method. The word execution isn't anywhere on the page, but I don't think it needs to be. Replicas are ultimately disposable and can be easily replaced. However, if those entrusted with upholding the law of a nation are regarded in such a way, those they preside over are inherently valued less in the pecking order. The definition of a replica describes what it is, but the definition of a gestalt simply says it is not a replica. Being defined by what you are not seems a tad indicative that gestalts are not preferable to replicas, likely because they are overall less efficient. To the nation, everyone is disposable in pursuit of a glorious war. It just so happens some are worth keeping around for slightly longer. What's also interesting about these biomechanical androids is their manufacturing. Replicas are synthetic humans produced to serve different roles in use in society. Each unit has recorded characteristics of their personality and how best to curtail volatile development known as persona degradation. Fetish objects are typically given to best stabilize replicas and prevent this process. Eulas are given music to dance and mirrors to look at themselves. Aras are given colourful flowers and trees. Stars get to keep a hold of their guns, and Adler gets to shove women down elevators.
Have a nice ball, you stupid bitch.
Bioresonance is also a neat in-universe creation that we'll dig more into when going through the story. Beams of what can be understood as psychic energy that can manipulate one's volition, distort perception of reality, and even be used to harm and kill enemy combatants as demonstrated by the Falk commanders. Through different perspectives on bioresonance's nature, it's established how much the two warring bodies of the nation and empire differ. The nation sees it as a product of sovereign ingenuity and bans literature postulating otherwise, while the empire regards it as a mystical and spiritual phenomenon hailing from their empress. The ongoing development of the replica and how psychological attempts are made to preserve them for as long as possible is a really intriguing aspect of the world. How the drawback of this mass-produced expendable labour force are the logistics of constant surveillance, expenditure of maintenance, and inevitably the bloody affair of replacement. How each unit has its own distinct personality, with some more commanding of authority whilst others are more resigned and introverted, makes what is essentially artificial intelligence very human and sympathetic. These are the ground troops of an oppressive regime that remain loyal for as long as their true identity as humans, as people, remains distorted. The moment that stops, the nation disposes of them and opts in for a more stable replacement. The well-being of the collective will always trump the condition of the individual, no matter how many it costs. The detail in Signalis' world-building is phenomenal. Your willingness to engage with this manufactured world is rewarded with enlightening tidbits about the replica, the gestalt, and the nature of life under the nation's control. One of the best sections in this game is Rotfront, the penultimate zone where you arrive in a residential district of a snowy planet under control of the nation. Gestalt residences and businesses are packed tight into these internal apartment blocks, entire livelihoods confined to boxes shut in by metal mesh doors and separated by concrete corridors laden with miscellaneous boxes and debris from ongoing life. It's vacant, yet feels completely lived in. There's something so homely about these eroding halls of civilian accommodation, how compact and communal everything is. The citizens of the nation aren't allowed to carry more than 6 personal belongings at a given time. How much do you think they'd allow you to even own? It also emphasizes the nation's focus on scientific advancement and innovation, writing off artistic pursuits as nothing but childish endeavor and compelling students to instead take greater focus on what the nation deems more meaningful use of one's time. Personal life was heavily regulated in the suburbs of Rotfront and was subjugated to frequent raids by Aeon commandos, militant replicas sent in to deal with suspected presences of Imperial spies. The deliberate thought given to everything is so emblematic of creators who were in love with what they were making. Frankly, I'm pretty jealous to see Rose Engine so openly ramble about their world and convey that with coherence that only further structures the story instead of taking away from it. Signalis is a game that has very little spoken dialogue and yet is able to convey so much. Take Elster, for instance. Her name is derived from her unit designation. The bird she is based off is a magpie, an avian creature that frequently goes around taking shiny objects and taking it back to its nest. Now tell me, dear viewer, what is the primary gameplay loop of Signalis? Venturing out into the unknown, finding shiny objects, and taking them back to your safe room for storage. When Rose Engine have been so meticulous about the name of the protagonist paralleling their diegetic behavior through play, you just know it's good. I don't want to spend all this video's runtime just fangirling about the world building, that's not the complete reason for why Signalis ruined my life, but that in of itself poses an important point. Even when the story is told as an interactive game, you can't cover everything. It wouldn't be feasible, nor particularly digestible. Yet there are people, nay dear viewer, fetid cretins, that have been led to believe good world building must do exactly that. Cover every nuance, every eventuality, or be branded as bad media. In a roundabout way to establish just how all this world building works to Signalis' benefit, I'm going to take a sledgehammer to this Reddit post. I am frequently in a position where I find myself alienated from gaming communities. Many a time I'll thoroughly enjoy a game, hop into the Discord server to ingratiate myself to my fellow gamers, and suddenly find other users asking me what my favourite goose-stepping technique is. I can only truly claim to have enjoyed 2 game-oriented communities, specifically on Discord, Darkest Dungeon Cord and Signalis Cord. Both of these are great, but Signalis Cord specifically is a really chill place that's filled with a lot of nice and goofy gay people who are similarly ruined by Signalis. I genuinely recommend that place if you're looking for a game community to be a part of. However, one member shared a Reddit post by user Gaiden Korinsky of r/noncredible defense that spoke about the nation in Signalis as being a truly incompetent entity. I thoroughly disagree, not just because I think it's an incorrect interpretation, but because I think it levies undeserved criticisms towards the world building and ultimately the quality of writing. And I can't have anyone attacking the honour of my fair maiden robot Yuri game. Generally what annoys me about this post is less that it tries to be critical about media that means a lot to me, but more that they are conflating their own refusal to suspend their belief and engage in the world with valid criticism. Some of these pick at what are artistic choices of presentation and aesthetic, like how CRTs are typically used but mass driver technology exists. The implicit criticism is that this is a nonsensical contradiction affecting the credibility of a constructed world. Why are they using outdated technology when they have achieved spaceflight, a heavily advanced technology? Alien did a similar thing, using analog unwieldy computer systems to control and power spaceflight. This aesthetic is a deliberate choice, as well as a result of temporal constraints. Their imagination of future tech was limited by their understanding of it at the time. But just because Signalis has come out in an era where we know tech has advanced into being more digital and streamlined and convenient, doesn't mean it's forbidden from doing a similar thing, from donning this aesthetic of cassette tape futurism, a term coined by Sphere Hunter during Health's Don't Try music video. It's a good creative choice. It's more novel, more unique, and frankly its unwieldiness and reliance on inferior tech is cool. Its use doesn't mean that spaceflight developments are impossible because of a now outdated monitor. We were in space before Pong was a thing. A lot of the critiques of the non-credibility of USAN as a nation strike a similar chord. Replicas not having feet and being tall are presented as if it's obvious as to why this doesn't make sense, instead of considering that maybe, for a mass-produced workforce, it would be cheaper to have them use metal stubs to walk instead of making all the parts necessary to add robo-grippers. Nor does it consider how perhaps the decision for replicas to be taller, specifically the ones that are frontline combat units and not the general purpose ones like Yules or Raz or even Elster, is not just to instill a respect for authority in the civilian populace, but also to dissuade dissidents through intimidating stature. Would you want to be in a fight with a metal robot that's almost twice your size and wants to hit you with a big fuck-off stick? I already know what the lesbians are gonna say. Another one is levied about how ridiculous the Penrose program is, the galactic colonization effort, because of how they only send one Gestalt replica, yet it seems like nothing but a suicide mission used as propaganda that wastes resources they clearly don't have. That is just plain wrong. With war ravaging the solar system and a nuke leveling Veneta, whose surface was covered in cities, mind you, it would be of the utmost importance to the nation to spread their influence not just for the sake of a widening domain, but also so human life isn't so readily decimated in a planetary conflict. The Penrose program doesn't exist as a fancy photo op turned prolonged euthanasia procedure. It exists to colonize new habitable planets and twist it into an act of glorious martyrdom if a ship fails to do so. It is partially propaganda, but they're not killing their people just for that. And here we go, the best for last. Complaints about how the nation limits individual expression. Sorry, what part of the uber-authoritarian government wasn't uber-authoritarian enough for you to notice? They don't care about what the individual has to say. They want an obedient workforce that can be endlessly used and replaced to fuel a galactic war. Why would they ever want their replicas to be developing individual thought and opinion when that's not what they were made or conceived to do? They keep them to a set of templates because they are models that consistently work with the least intrusive drawbacks and costs. There is literally a document later in the game that addresses exactly that. Giving them fetish objects is a worthwhile trade-off for having access to mass-produced labor that can be integrated into almost all human workforces without needing massive adjustments to pre-existing industries or a need to create new facilities for them specifically. The oppression is kind of a fucking point. This post, in all respect, radiates a bitter and sour energy. The complaints about the nation really just seek to interrogate why it's not a completely different premise because of their own refusal to actually engage with Signalis in good faith. It's the equivalent of watching someone get given a pizza and then asking why it's not a succulent Chinese meal.
Get your hand off my nose!
Considering the nation is an extremely important part of a constructed world, criticisms of it imply that the world Rose Engine has made is flawed in the context of creating a believable setting. That using outdated visual tech in a world that is otherwise technologically advanced is a result of writers who don't know how to make a coherent setting, that are relying on contrivance to set the stage for the story because they're not good enough as writers to find more believable and interesting ways of doing so. This is just wrong. This is what I meant earlier when I said that world building can be difficult, because you can't explain everything without it overshadowing the narrative you're trying to tell, yet, for a surprisingly sizable amount of people, that's considered a bad thing. The Scourge of Cinema Sins has popularized the idea that everything that happens on screen needs to be explained and notarized for the audience. Every dot has to be joined up for them the moment it comes into existence, and that is simply the antithesis to good world building. The implicit message is that Signalis' nation would be credible, and by extension the world building of Signalis would be better, if it footnoted everything with explanations that covered all nuances raised here. So, in this poster's ideal iteration, an account that finds it weird the overtly authoritarian nation is so dubious about the one thing overt authoritarian nations typically do not like, Signalis' core component of world building that sets the stage for its story would be better if it throttled its pacing completely with irrelevant detail with all the prevailing grace of a blind circumcision. My opinion is, and prepare yourselves, this may be controversial, this is a terrible idea and I hate this post. Okay, in complete fairness, part of it is clearly a joke that shouldn't be taken seriously, but it also makes acknowledgements that the game would agree with. Rose Engine have created the nation to overall be an unwieldy government body that poses no benefit for humankind, despite its obsession with efficient labour and industry. Not as a criticism of a world's creation, but more so an agreement with Signalis' subliminal messaging. That a government who eclipses the meaning of the individual with endless work is bad and inefficient, which agrees with what the game is trying to say. Making your faction or characters do something out of ignorance or incompetence isn't always a bad sign of writing. It can be a meaningful moment of character development or a significant point made about a real-world parallel. There are genuine critiques of a nation that the game itself is raising. How can you expect the best of a workforce you rely on when so many of them are battered and broken, like the ARA unit in Events? The obsession with efficiency is actually breeding inefficiency. So when I see this post arguing the nation's lack of credibility, which would mean a lack of believability in this world, that is a wrongfully attributed critique of Signalis as a story. That the system Elster's lesbian adventure takes place within only works as a contrivance to service this narrative because it doesn't stop the momentum every 5 seconds to explain how things work to a minority of audiences who are always going to interrogate things that sane people will just assume works as normal. That one's own inability to infer and interpret is somehow the story's failing. The conclusions I've made can be backed up by notes and exposition in the game. I'm not just pulling things out of my arse like it's a Saturday night. It's also annoying because there are some genuine questions to be asked about the world instead of these silly points, like, why are replicas designed with a function to sleep? There's a note from a replica who ended up sleeping in a corridor because their map module stopped working and they couldn't find their dorm. If you wanted all the working capacity of humans at large quantity without all the logistical strain of maintaining a human workforce, why would you retain the one bodily function that eats through a third of the working day? A potential answer is to maintain the biomechanical components, as they are ultimately biological organisms. It's just a part of the overall logistical cost of this new cutting-edge technology. The fact this post doesn't even entertain this more reasonable inquiry of the world speaks volumes. I was only able to make these observations because I was engaging with the game so I could pay attention to the details. When you're so unwilling to even entertain the premise, you're denying yourself the opportunity to even notice and critique these things. But, even more important than ignoring genuine questions in favour of being a pedant, this post also treats the act of making the world as a purely literal thing. Everything has to happen for an exact reason, conveyed fully to the audience and makes immediate sense, pacing and intrigue be damned, or it just doesn't work. It refuses to acknowledge a built world's ability to work as a metaphor, an allegory, to be part of something more abstract and emotional. And that is how Signalis' established world, of Elster's perspective within the confines of a nation's galactic borders, sets the stage well for the narrative to be told. We finally made it, dear viewer, to the core component of what has ruined many people's lives. Say hello to the story of Signalis. Take a look at this room. It's terrible, isn't it? Unhygienic, chaotic, cluttered, and filthy. This image is really the only meaningful thing Asmongold has contributed to the internet, and, as a result, I now have a visual comparison for the story of Signalis. It is messy, but, unlike Asmongold's attempt to convert his own home into an insect habitat, it's deliberate. Where this image is a result of neglect, Signalis' story is a purposeful obfuscation of key details behind many layers employed in skillful fashion. It is, frankly, inconceivable how mere mortals could construct and conjure something with such major respect for detail while still not forgetting to establish the broader world. So, dear viewer, let us take a closer look at the underpinning element of all media and try to understand what it could possibly mean. Important disclaimer, I'm going to have to get analytical. From this point forth, the video may get a little dry. Also, I must disclaim, I have deliberately abstained from watching any other video essays or analysis videos on Signalis to ensure I am delivering peak, undiluted, smug rubric genius. So, if at any point you believe my objectively correct interpretation to somehow be incorrect, don't get mad, I'm just being the unique snowflake my mother tells me to be. When peering into Signalis' story, it's important to distinguish the literal events of the plot from the narrative's metaphorical background, what is grounded in reality and should be taken at face value versus what is established as symbolism, as meaningful imagery, as aspects left up to the interpretation of the audience for their true message. Usually, I find myself somewhat dissatisfied with media that heavily relies on leaving the interpretation up to the audience, not because the concept itself warrants ire, but because typically its implementation is being used to compensate for narrative failings. It becomes a DIY approach to storytelling, where the writer is free to set up a lot of cool plot devices without the responsibility of tying them up satisfyingly. But Signalis enraptured me with how it lets open interpretation be used to engage and direct its audience. When Elster approaches the elevator she fell down, there are tons of bodies packed inside that look exactly like her. You think she'd remark on the dumped corpses bearing a striking resemblance to her, but instead comments that the elevator isn't working. You, with your eyes, can see she's being a tad reductionist. This is a simple trick. By letting the player make that realization for themselves, adding in this middleman of the player's own observations, it makes understanding Signalis a far more rewarding experience that ultimately primes the player to be paying closer attention to what they're actually seeing on the entire screen, and not just what gets pointed out to them in the small box at the bottom. It ensures that at least everyone can walk away understanding the plot, the sequence of events of Signalis' story. Elster Yuri, the most violent lesbian in the galaxy, arrives at S23 to find a worker known as Alina CO, who we are led to believe is missing from our crashed ship. After the title drop sequence that establishes the tone of what's to come, as well as the foreboding cutscene of corrupted replicas wandering the halls when we further descend, we come to understand that S23 has fallen victim to an unknown virulent disease that has killed all of the Gestalt workers and left security forces as wandering bands of bloodthirsty marauders. Alina CO is supposedly stranded in the mines at the bottom of a facility. And with that, the goal for the player is set. Get to the mines and find her. However, as Elster proceeds, she is repeatedly flashed with hallucinations of a woman with white hair, of a remote radio station out in the sticks of a rot front, of her being bullied in school. This isn't Alina CO, who we also see brief glimpses of during our descent, so despite the game deliberately framing her as our objective, the game is also hinting that something is amiss. This is supplemented by the Protector's dorm section. Before this, a EULA nurse remarks that she thinks she recognizes you. Innocuous enough, we know units are mass-produced, and there likely has been another Elster unit model there prior. Yet when Adler does his Joe Goldberg routine and shoves you off a ledge, he remarks that you shouldn't have returned. You wake up on a pile of Elster unit corpses, all fallen victim to the same fate, and you later find a note by Calibri saying despite there being no report of one ever being summoned, Adler has memories of an Elster unit being brought down to the mines to oversee operations. In the diary on his desk, he writes,
I was playing with that mechanical lockbox again, of which I am now sure is some kind of astronomical calendar, when I suddenly remembered a conversation I had with another replica when I was inspecting the mining site. However, it was clearly a model I have never seen before. Some type of engineer with an orange chest piece. In my memory, she was just another member of our staff, but no such replica was ever stationed on Sierpinski. Replica memory is not the most reliable, they say, but never before have I experienced such a strange phenomenon.
Adler also has a file on the Elster unit sitting across the room, as if he's been fervently reading up on this replica he keeps remembering. How weird. Elster has no recollection of being there before, neither does the player, hence the diegetic use of the player's intrigue, but Adler, amidst a few others, does. That diary goes on to describe the deteriorating condition of a facility, how more people are falling sick, which serves to reinforce something we already know. It's only after we get the astrolabe from the inside of this peculiar little novel, we'll get to this fella, trust me, that we can glean greater insight as to what is happening.
I've been feeling strangely paranoid these days. Never before have I felt so strongly the sensation of déjà vu as I have these past few days. When I checked the pages of my diary today, I noticed that for some inexplicable reason I seem to have dated my previous entries with today's date. What an embarrassing mistake. Every day feels a bit like I've lived it before, and even stronger is the sensation that something is somehow just slightly out of place.
As we read on, it's less likely a mistake, and more likely something sinister at work.
Why is my diary filled with entries I cannot recall writing? Why are they all dated to today? Has the loss of my beloved commander finally gotten to my mind? Am I going insane? I fear what will happen to me if anyone finds out. I am alone in this. If they discover my notes, I'll be decommissioned too. It feels as though in this room I peer into another version of reality. How? I do not know. Perhaps I too have become sick like the others without realizing. But I will not succumb. A slow accumulation of reproduction errors, a gradual corruption of information, a story misremembered, slowly morphing with each retelling, like genetic material, mutating and evolving, like the replica mind, copied over and over from an aging template? I do not know, but I will find out. The answers lie below. I can feel it. Someone or something calls me from there. In the mine.
Elster being remembered when she hasn't been there before. Bodies of Elster units crammed into an elevator shaft. Adler's testimony of reliving the same days slightly altered. Welcome to the time loop. Whatever was unearthed in the mines, overseen by the first Elster unit, has proliferated the spread of a mysterious disease and subjected the facility to the same harrowing events as everything gets increasingly more dire. That explains why bodies are still left around. The loop of an Elster unit coming to the facility and venturing down to the mines reoccurs, meeting some different end, but restarts upon every demise befalling her. That's why when you die as Elster, you pick right back up from where you left off, in front of that glaring red screen, memories of somewhere else flashing before your eyes. A really cool way of incorporating the gameplay loop into the narrative time loop, and another example of how insane Rose engine are. Remember the opening section with the Elster unit in the suit? She dies. At the end of the sequence, the death screen appears that usually is only shown if you die in the game. Following this, you awake in a completely different area of a facility, and there is no suit to be seen. Considering how deliberate the detail of this game is, surely the best way to bridge over this change of setting would be having the suit in the open stall for Elster to remark on briefly, to imply continuity. Its lack of presence is deliberate, and, before you've even realized it, has already established the story's cyclical nature. But what exactly happened here? Those answers can be found during our descent into Nowhere. Nowhere is a derelict and decaying shrine, half converted into a research station far below the mines, sitting at the bottom of a hole the excavation had uncovered. As we know, the nation is an industrious entity that is focused on tangible progress, like developing infrastructure and furthering technology. It's very out of character for them to construct a shrine to anything, especially not a church to the late empress that was once their oppressor, and was likely sealed because they discovered what awaited them below, and decided to not tamper with it. It's very Lovecraftian, similar to how Darkest Dungeon's conflict, a game overwhelmingly inspired by Lovecraftian premises and themes, comes to pass because of the ancestor unearthing evil below his estate. That being said, it is my least favourite chapter from a visual design standpoint. Oh my god, fleshy, pulsating walls, amorphous meat chimeras stumbling around, daring today. Aren't we? What is notable from this area, for direct story implications, is a note from Alina. She's lost track of time, doesn't understand where she is, and her memory blurs, as if she'd always been trapped down there. Her hair is slowly turning white. She's remembering a life different to hers, and the line between her and this mysterious second person is blurring. In the commander's bedroom, a diary at her bedside writes about the events leading to her infection. Something called the Red Eye showed her something at the gate, infected her with someone else's memory, stuck between herself and a white-haired girl. Up until now, the game has been careful to only show us one person with white hair. In the same room of Alina C.O.'s note, there's a painting called Metamorphosis, a word that describes a process of transformation specific to bugs. It's a subtle affirmation of what the player is already thinking without outright saying it. Alina C.O. is becoming the white-haired girl, and the commander is blurring with someone who remembers her. But how? And who is she? Clearing Nowhere, Elster Yuri arrives at the gate, the very same threshold she crossed at the beginning of the game, given a bit of a recoloring. Adler speaks of how when the commander came back from crossing the threshold, she was someone else entirely. She was no longer Commander Falk, that he's been there so many times, yet never returned. A one-way trip he's repeatedly made because of this time loop. Elster says, in true bad bitch fashion, she doesn't care.
Shut up, bitch!
And proceeds across the threshold. Awaiting her is an endless waste of red, interceded with black pillars and corpses of other Elster units that already made similar crude pilgrimages but didn't end so well. Someone starts calling to her, telling her to draw closer, and we are shown a lineup of Gestalt women following the name Alina C.O. Only one turns. After revealing that whoever is calling Elster has been waiting, Elster's name appears, and every replica in this line turns, one after the other, as if echoing through prior instances of her arrival. It's here where the name Ariane Yong appears, and, upon being said, every single Gestalt woman turns in unison. Every Elster unit has arrived looking for someone different, but by the time they make it down there, they realise who they were truly looking for. Images of a Venettan front, the nuclear blast, Alina CO standing by an unknown soldier who's also shown clutching a bleeding eye are shown on screen as Elster approaches the ship. A prompt to remember our promise appears before she climbs to the top and desperately tries to open the ship hatch. Too weak to do so, she breaks off her own arm in her desperation and tumbles down the side of the spacecraft. It's as she is lying there, broken and immobile, that she realises how hopeless it is and promptly dies. If the game had ended there, it would have been unsatisfying. In polite terms, quite fucking bad. A lot of things got set up, half of them got meaningfully resolved. This would be the vagueness that you'd expect from someone using their open to interpretation presentation to cover incomplete stories. I think Rose Engine understood this potential experience, because if you click quit after completing this, it won't let you. They didn't want anyone walking away, potentially with only half a story, thinking they had just been narratively blueballed. The game restarts, and you wake up on the same ship, this time with an adorable little naval cap, and you realise that something is different. Everything is working. No longer is the ship plagued by disrepair and decay. The ship is lived in. Taking a look around, you find an adorable drawing of a Calibri and a transmission congratulating you on your service.
By our calculations, 1,500 cycles of mission time will have passed by the time you received this message. Congratulations, comrade. By now, you should have fully acclimatized to your new life on board your ship. As you approach the Ord Cloud, your search for new worlds will begin. Utilizing the long-range sensors, you will scout for valuable resources, habitable worlds, or signs of alien life. Remember to rely on your replica to assist you in maintaining your vessel. We all wish you great success in your mission.
This ship is part of Operation Penrose, also known as the Penrose Project, finding new worlds to inhabit and making grand scientific discoveries in service of Yusan. That was what this ship was intended for. When we get to one of the rooms, we find a written report by the scout officer of the ship, Ariane Yong.
I've adjusted the ship's internal clock to run slightly slower. By my calculations, each cycle should be exactly 12.6% longer, simulating what I believe is the length of a day on Veneta. I wonder if Ulster will notice the difference. Judging from her accent, I'm sure that she's Venettan. She pronounces ship just like Issa and Ari used to. It's very cute. Hearing her speak makes me dream of the ocean. I wonder if I'll ever get to visit something like it. Maybe on a distant world?
Elster, an affectionate pseudonym taken from her unit name's pronunciation, is the replica tasked with maintaining the Penrose during its maiden voyage through space. These units are chosen for their affinity for being alone and desire only for basic needs. In another room, we find yet another entry showing what assumedly Ariane has been doing in her spare time.
I'm running out of ochre paint. Ulster laughed when I told her. Now I have to fix it myself. So annoying. I still haven't read a whole bunch of those manuals. I feel like they gave me enough to read for the rest of my life. Most of them are boring technical manuals anyway, and they could have given us more films to watch instead. Half of them are war films, which Ulster doesn't like, and the other half are kitschy propaganda dramas.
Artistically inclined, unfettered towards the nation, and calling their films propaganda, but strangely friendly towards Elster. Considering there is a file on this replica specifying to not befriend it, this is interesting. When we finally meet Ariane, we see that she's maybe a little more than just a friend.
I talked some more to the Ulster unit. She's different from the replicas I knew back home. Nothing like my teachers or the Blockwork Protector. I know she didn't have a choice, but it feels like she's also here because she didn't fit in. It's like we've run away from the world together. At first, I didn't like having someone around, and I was glad that she was quiet and didn't approach me, but lately, I've missed having someone I can talk to. It's been so long since I've seen another person. I never thought I'd miss it. Except her. Everything is the same in here, always. Nothing ever changes.
This relationship between these two, in half a second of seeing their interaction, is immediately understood by the audience. Neither of them say anything directly conducive of a loving couple, is not told directly, nor is it said anywhere else in the game about them being an item, but the way they refer to one another in their notes and how they behave around one another sells what they are. They celebrate their 3,000 cycle anniversary, falling asleep together when a familiar noise starts to play. Elster wakes up again in the snowy wastes, beaten, worse for wear, barely alive. Getting inside, we come to understand how this situation so quickly fell into tragedy.
I lost another tooth. There was so much blood. My hands were shaking. Why is my hair falling out? I can't sleep. I just want to sleep. Please. Please, just let me sleep.
In the next room, we find the cryopod overtaken by a pulsating mass similar to those we see in Nowhere. The implication of what we have read and seen is clear. Ariane Yong is stranded, eternally suffering, and we need to save her. The framing of what comes next is excellently done without the need of an objective marker or written reminder. We started this looking for Alina, and now we are finding Ariane to save her. Elster salvages a dead Elster unit beside the cryopod to stabilize herself, takes the plunge into the facility, now suffering even greater catastrophic damage, and descends into the heart of the nation's urban sprawl, Rotfront. Okay, slow your roll, bisexual dog guy. How the fuck did we get here? How the hell does Elster remember Ariane? If it's a time loop, how are these memories of this mystery woman reaching her? Does any of this even make sense? Good questions. As we covered in the world building segment, bioresonant technology allows one to see another's thoughts, affect their volition, as well as alter perception of reality. Who's doing this? Well, Ariane. Let me explain. We find out a lot of information in Rotfront, and it tells us a lot about what it's like being a citizen of the nation. Ariane spent her time attending Montalbrot Technical School as part of her compulsory education and subsequent military service, having been compelled to move away from the remote radio facility she lived at with her mother. It's one of the first flashbacks we get in the game, just after unlocking the butterfly box. We find a note left by a teacher claiming she dallies too much with art and music and doesn't apply herself to scientific and academic pursuit, likely because of the alternative lifestyle living in the mountains gave her. We already saw the painting on the ship, but there's also another one in her dorm room at the end of a safe room corridor. It explains why during a flashback we see her getting bullied by the other students. She's an outcast for having interests at odds with what the culture expects. We see this from the perspective of Isolde Ito, a woman we meet repeatedly throughout the game who's searching for her sibling, Erika Ito. Ariane was living with her aunt at the time, Camilla Yong, working part-time as an employee at her shop, and became friends of local residents known as the Ito family that ran a bookstore nearby. There are three sisters, Erika, Lilith, and Isa Ito. Ariane specifically mentions Erika in this excerpt.
I had a strange dream. I was listening to the radio with my mother, like back then. The numbers were on, and Mother was taking notes with a book on her lap. It was that book I saw in the shop window of the bookstore where the twins lived, the one with the yellow hooded figure on the cover. When I went there to buy it, it was gone, and Erica said the protectors had confiscated it.
During Isa's flashback, she also mentions she's trying to find Erika before she leaves. These guys were likely in the same class, so likely the same age. We only see Lilith Ito from a photograph of Alina Sio's service on Veneta before it got the Halo Reach treatment, which happened after she was transferred to S-23. So Lilith was likely significantly older and already in the use in infantry, which is why Ariane has no memory beyond this image. Rotfront shows us a lot about Ariane's life, but the way it's constructed, with a hospital room she stayed in leading right into a random corridor and some random adjoined bedroom, shows it to be nonsensical, like it's been hastily pasted over the actual depths of a facility, the interior of a dream haphazardly connecting areas that have no business being in such proximity. Well, during this, we see that the block has been locked down due to the presence of an Imperial spy. As we complete the tarot card puzzle, we find a note left behind by the agent of sabotage, where they make the following remark: "I'm sure the white-haired girl working at the photo store is bioresonant." But how is that possible? Bioresonance emerges from replica construction, synthetic and artificial humanoids. Not exactly. In the dark apartment, we find a classified government dossier intended only for the eyes of replica technicians, the people constructing and maintaining the biomechanical androids.
Carefully selected by Aeon, exemplary citizens of the nation are permanently cryogenically preserved in neural archives, each becoming a neural pattern for a new replica model. To preserve the image of the replica as an incorruptible ideal, the original gestalt is erased from records and public memory. During the production process, when experienced bioresonant technicians copy that neural pattern to a new unit, a majority of episodic memories are altered and suppressed. While the resulting replica maintains the skills and personality of the original gestalt, it will be incapable to recall specific events from the life of the donor under normal circumstances. This ensures the replica performs its duties without distractions created by personal memories of the donor. However, even the best maintained replica unit will eventually be exposed to stimuli that may cause gestalt memories to resurface. While units degraded in such a way pose no particular danger, like all units with persona degradation, they will eventually lose many of their advantages over gestalt workers. Because persona degradation is usually difficult to identify from the outside, bioresonance is used by command units to surveil units under their command. Generally, it is recommended to swiftly decommission and replace units before their productivity decreases or they begin to show clear signs of individuality. When ammunition is rationed, alternative ways of decommissioning may be deployed at the discretion of local operational command.
Bioresonance originates from Gestalt people, specifically a small number referred to as exemplary citizens, whose scans are cryogenically preserved and copied from. Replicas are the products of Gestalts, sentients grafted from theirs and uploaded to constructed frames. We've known this since the Protector dorms, but it's only here we realise how much more involuntary the process is. Colibris and Falks are a product of this process, and bioresonance can only emerge as a result of these imposed conditions. So how does Ariane do it? The events of the Penrose are the twisted origin. Following this sweet rendezvous between Elster and Ariane on their 3000 cycle anniversary, a transmission is received from Mission Control explaining the next steps. Or, better put, lack thereof.
Congratulations, comrade. You have survived 3,000 cycles, reaching the final phase of the Penrose program. With the end of the operational lifetime of your replica unit approaching, it is time to prepare for the final phase of your mission. If you have not found a suitable world for landing by this point, accept that you will not. Find solace in the thought that others might be successful where you failed. As you are probably aware, your ship's spare parts and rations will soon be depleted. Life support systems and reactor shielding will soon begin to fail, and radiation may begin to leak from the cooling system. We recommend that you do not attempt to prolong your suffering by reusing old filters or by rationing supplies. Instead, make peace with your fate. We suggest that you ask your replica, while it is still functional, to spare you a slow and agonizing death, or that you take permanent rest in the cryogenic pod. Remember, you will have died serving your nation by partaking in a glorious demonstration of our power.
Mission Control explains there is no point fending off the inevitable. Without a habitable planet to thrive on and supplies dwindling, Ariane will die sooner or later. A neat detail is before the dance we find a manual next to the 1500 cycles transmission explaining that it's not recommended to try and survive on replica biocomponents, as if Ariane had some lurking fear about what would happen if they never found anywhere to live, especially after 3000 days of nothing but the monotony of the space-flying coffin.
Everything's always the same. I feel like I'm trapped inside this ship. I know every bolt on every panel in every room of it. I've seen everything. I've done everything there is to do in here. I can't concentrate or anything. It's like there's this fog in my head. Whenever I try to do anything, I just can't focus. I want to go outside. I want to breathe fresh air. I want to feel wind on my face and in my hair.
This was written 1840 cycles into the voyage. It only took just over halfway for Ariane to start hating it. But that's the thing, the voyage lasted more than just 3000 cycles. As what the transmission had forewarned came to pass, it just kept going. Painfully so.
I'm tired of it all. Every time I go to sleep, I wonder if I'll wake up again. I'm scared that it'll be the last time I say goodnight to her. Did I say it right? Will she be okay? What if one of us just doesn't wake up tomorrow? I don't want to die. I don't want to live anymore either. Everything is just so exhausting. I just want to lie down and disappear. I just want to sleep. Please, just let me sleep. Please, just make it stop. Please.
Ariane Yong, suffering from acute radiation sickness because of the leaking coolant from her ship, is dying. Elster, who we now know was romantically involved, couldn't bring herself to kill her, so stows her away in a cryopod in the hope that she will find a planet stable enough to live on, to live together. Towards the end of the game, we realise that she too eventually succumbed to the radiation seeping into the ship and couldn't save Ariane from her excruciating sickness. This is how Ariane Yong lived, suffered, and potentially died as an outcast. But most crucially, her fatal predicament puts her in conditions that are similar, if not exactly the same, as what bioresonance templates get put in for copying to replica frames. The happy memories of life aboard the ship before it went wrong keep getting intercepted by Falk and Adler because of Ariane's bioresonance and the cascade of tragedy that led to her being stranded in eternal sleep. This bioresonant capability is what gives rise to the proliferation of the disease. Falk is bioresonant, so when the sealed shrine was unearthed at the bottom of the mines, her bioresonance attuned to this malevolent cosmic force and put it on loudspeaker for the entire facility to succumb to. Colibris, who were designed to amplify bioresonance signals to maintain morale amidst their comrades, would accidentally spread this to the majority of the facility's inhabitants. Back in Nowhere, you find a pamphlet talking about the songs of the cosmos that can still be heard in the Aether. In Rotfront, you find a written entry, a book called Song of the Gods, unsurprisingly considered contraband by the nation. It speaks of a deep vibration of the cosmos only a few are fully aware and conscious of, something that shapes and deforms us. Of these select few are an even smaller minority who are able to manipulate the essence of the world around them. Bioresonance doesn't just alter perception of reality, it alters reality itself. We now understand the sudden appearance of Rotfront's haphazard architecture. Rotfront is the chapter that puts everything into context. Elster's story, or at least the emergent entity of Elster, didn't start searching S23 for Alina's CO. She started all the way back on the Penrose with Ariane. Ariane was placed in cryosleep. The Elster aboard the ship died, and the conditions gave rise to Ariane's unknown bioresonance to start shaping the world around it. In Nowhere, next to an altar with the outline of a body, we find a journal called The Dreamer. It waxes poetical about someone floating in a sea of flesh deep below, makes mention of a red eye, another thing we have to get back to in this endless list of self-hatred, and every time the dreamer turns over in their sleep, the world turns over too, until only flesh remains. Notice how when Elster gets near the crashed Penrose ship and comes back to the facility, the flesh has spread further. Ariane was disturbed during her slumber, and consequently, more of the world has been conceded to the cosmic abnormality she is attuned to. That's why Adler was writing about those memories he had of Ariane with her tarot cards, and Falk's diary mentioned this white-haired girl specifically, yet both of them aren't merging with her like Alina wrote. They are seeing her from another perspective. Elster's perspective. They are Elster's memories, amplified by the tortured Ariane, forever cursing S23's inhabitants. Clearing Rotfront, Elster Yuri arrives back in that small cubby. This is likely Ariane's room, or some affiliated chamber she had back home. In the beginning of the game, looking at the miscellaneous objects yielded little interesting description beyond a sentence. All that was really described was the flag, the sigil of Yusan, an implicit sign of where Elster's true allegiances lay. But by the time we're back here, Elster describes everything in relation to Ariane. She understands why they mean so much to her now, but this time the flag gets little to no description. She refers to it as ultimately meaningless. In the next room is Ariane's home living room, and beyond is the hopelessly distorted reality left in the wake of Penrose 512's failure. Notes on the ground leave written descriptions of Elster's memories, the island on the water, the search for Ariane, the promise, the borders of the self-blur. On the final page, it is impossible to tell where Falk ends and Elster begins. Entering the next chamber, Falk confronts you for the final boss fight. Plagued with your memories, Elster Yuri is pitted against a lesbian capable of equally horrific violence, armed with the 1984 Mind Beam.
You have been.
The emergent entity in two separate bodies fighting itself for ownership of this love that revitalizes existence. A love that grants purpose beyond being an expendable, indentured slave. A love so potent you will die repeatedly trying to get back to it. Only one of you can return to her again. Honor the promise of saving her. Force feed this hag your ballistic arsenal enough times, and finally, she will be slain. Elster Yuri, now that only one of her line can cross the threshold. Adler is there again to meet her, and attempts to halt your efforts with a London classic. Unfortunately, the Venetian soldier Elster was scanned from was Arthur Morgan, and she quick draws that bitch in a blink of an eye. Adler laments that if she crosses that threshold again, she will ruin everything. Elster doesn't care. It's at this point we get to the 3 endings. What's neat about Signalis is instead of leaving these conclusions up to a binary choice at the end of the game, excising this decision from the player's experience overall is a culmination of how the player played the game. The first is the leave ending. If you played in an ambivalent manner, repeatedly tried locked doors, spent a long time in flashbacks, talked to every NPC multiple times, so on, Elster doesn't go inside. She dies on the roof of the ship, petrified from entering. This makes sense, because you were playing in a way that showed she was unwilling to go on, hesitant to forsake her happy memories, too scared to proceed. Clearly, she was not the first. During the fake ending, we find many corpses of Elsters who couldn't bring themselves to complete the journey. The second is memory. If you completed the game as quickly as possible, avoided fights with enemies and often didn't get hit, you walk into the cryopod chamber to find Ariane Young lying dormant. You wake her up and find that, despite prompting her, she doesn't recognize you anymore. The love that you killed and perished in the name of is gone. Elster lies down by the pod, last words begging Ariane to let her stay by her side, and then dies seconds after. We also find this Elster dead by the pod before the rot front chapter. This leads to the final conclusion, the promise ending. Up until now, the details of this promise have never been revealed to us by the game. It's that classic implementation of not telling the player what to expect or what's coming, letting them piece together what's happening through inferring what they're seeing. The way the game frames this makes it seem like the promise is a vague oath to save Ariane. Save her like the first Elsa had tried so hard to do on the Penrose. But if you were paying attention, read those blood-covered notes left behind by Ariane, and came to understand the severity of her situation, you probably would also understand that Elster was saving her in a far more tragic way than most players would hope. Elster enters the chamber, and this time, Ariane remembers her. She's been waiting for so long. Elster can't bring herself to do it, and it's only after Ariane begs her that she finally agrees. Elster, with all the love she has in her lonely and beaten heart, wraps her hands around Ariane's throat and kills her. Once she's realized what she's done, she lies down beside the cryopod and succumbs to her injuries. I had known this to be what's coming since the fake ending cryopod scene, and never before was I so thrilled to be rewarded for paying attention, but also so miserable that I had been right on this, of all things. Signalis doesn't want to act like it's smarter than the player, pull some contrived and unforeseen conclusion out of its arse just to have the cheap shock value of a twist. And I really commend that. I also commend how while other writers may have made this a happy ending, maybe Elster does save Ariane and they live happily ever after, Rose Engine understood it wouldn't meld well with the tone of the story. I think this is the game's intended definitive ending. The other two almost seem like stages before this, glimpses of what befell other Elsters that couldn't honour the promise. Many fled and died out in the wastes, one more determined than the others made entry but couldn't bring themselves to terrify the love of their life by killing them, and finally, one Elster, able to summon the tremendous courage, put her love out of her misery. It is a wonderfully miserable ending to a wonderfully miserable game. Are we surprised this was how it was going to end? To the German people, the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet is the average romantic comedy. At first, and maybe still a little bit now, I felt this was a tad at odds with the gameplay. The manner of play that gets you memory, the one I got twice as a result of my paranoid hoarding of ammo and sick ankle-breaking moves, is ultimately the more efficient one, the one that I think is necessitated on higher difficulties and is arguably more fun. Almost feels a little like I was punished for playing with greater consideration for my limited resources, something inherently encouraged by the genre. But one of the prerequisites for the promise ending is not talking to any NPC. This would be ridiculous to expect of players during their first time through, almost the antithesis to how the design beckons intrigue, so maybe this was expected for a following playthrough. And I do get this, I really do see how this is intended to work, and it does. Where Memory's ending requires a more cautious and hesitant style of play, likely inferring this Elster would be too scared to kill Ariane, or that her hesitation took so much time Ariane forgot her. Promise requires a playstyle that loathes the concept of self-preservation. Dying repeatedly, getting hit often and not healing instantly, likely because you're engaging in so many fights you don't have enough healing packs to compensate. Killing a lot of enemies, ignoring NPCs and pushing on. It implies an Elster that is more focused, more brazen, more desperate to do what she has to do. By the time she gets to the ship, she's endured so much that she knows the chances of another her making a future return aren't great, and she has to make the most of this now while she is still alive to do so. It's also likely that most players, unlike the god gamer I am, will die and fail often. For many, Falk was a hard fight, but for me, she was just another hoe on my journey to greatness. So managing to make the definitive ending promise something most players can get their first time through, it is narratively the most rewarding one, whilst also making the playstyle of people who may not be that good make sense as the path to get there, is remarkably impressive. So while I still feel getting rewarded for more skilled play with an ending where I'm forgotten is slightly unsatisfying, I boast the maturity to look past my cope and see the bigger picture. By this point, being forgotten by the people I love really should be something I've become accustomed to by now. I really need to stop being a bitch. While some parts of this do require greater inference and a focused analytical lens, the bulk of the story, and the payoff for sticking with it until its dire and sad conclusion, is made apparent to the audience in a fashion that rewards their engagement. This sickening time loop where things get worse and worse with every subsequent attempt to glean meaning, purpose, and happiness from the irradiated ashes of a life you can't get back. The world will not let you get it back. What Elster was pursuing wasn't happiness or a second chance, but closure. An end to Ariane's ceaseless suffering, and an end to Elster's eternal madness. A love united in death that can no longer be assailed by the demands of a heartless and hateful universe around them. This was Elster doing the best with what she had. The closest thing we have to a happy ending is the fourth one, the hidden artifact conclusion. By bringing 3 keys from across the game to the lockbox in Ariane's room, you can pick up a pot of lilies. We see this in the ship in the flashback. Elster places it upon a pedestal and dies near other corpses of prior iterations with empty podiums. And a glowing prism lying atop an altar shows Elster and Ariane dancing once more in their bedroom. This, to me, is Elster resigning herself to living in the past. She doesn't have to bring herself to do this to Ariane. She can pass beside love, living love, and not have to hurt anymore. The plot of Signalis abides by this lovingly constructed frame that ensures even the most confused players, for as long as they are attempting to understand, will finish this game feeling they had lived through a complete and satisfying story. But what does this mean? What is the King in Yellow? What is the Red Eye? What is the Isle of the Dead? What is this menagerie of vague details and minute aspects that keep beckoning us in, keep dragging us further away from sanity, keep prompting us to descend again and again and again? In this mess of imagery, metaphor, and symbolism, where deducing reality from dream induces active harm on the mortal psyche, what is Signalis about? What does Signalis represent? Excellent question, dear viewer. Very pragmatic line of inquiry. Before I answer, take a pause. Take a breath. Go outside. Actually, cancel that. Stay inside. The world is a dangerous place. Just chill for a moment and forget the strife of existence. Why am I asking you to do this? Because I'm about to inflict greater strife upon you. We're not done. Despite a video of this length and a script of this length to fully describe and interpret meaning from this, we have to go further. Even though this game has taken too much time from my life already, and dangerous amounts of serotonin have been deprived from my synapses, we still have another chapter to go. Thank you for asking, dear viewer, but no, I am not okay. I pretend to be a dog PNG online, I'm currently living through an economic recession, and I thought it was a reasonable idea to try and animate an intro with no prior experience in doing so. I think the question as to my mental stability was well and truly answered a long time ago. I must say, however, this fellow hasn't exactly been making things better. The King in Yellow. I always hated the monarchy, so it really is no wonder that he has it out for me. Remember the opening? Elster gets her face melted. How does this happen? The King in Yellow is there. This book is a collection of short stories written by American author Mr. Robert W. Chambers. In many of these stories, mainly the first 4, the cast of characters fall into madness and tragedy after coming into contact with this vague play known as the King in Yellow. The play's second act, as described by the Wikipedia article I'm heavily relying on to guide me, is what causes the reader to go mad from the irresistible nature of the revealed truths. The first story, The Repairer of Reputations, is about a man who, after reading the play, gets admitted to an asylum and eventually dies for some undisclosed reason. How intriguing it is that the moment you touch it, Elster is hit with a wave of hallucinations and flashbacks and a bout of mania before perishing from the exposure. She dies in a similar manner to how Calibri's attempt to kill you in the game. One of the characters in this first story, Louis Castaigne, remarks that the play supposedly holds truths that send men frantic and blast their lives. Elster, following this exposure, ardently pursues this vague objective of rescuing this worker even at the cost of her own well-being. She's already undergone severe persona degradation at the start of the game before the player even knows what that is. This isn't the only time the King in Yellow appears. To get the astrolabe to open Adler's lockbox, you need to complete this bookshelf puzzle. The astrolabe is inside the King in Yellow. As we know now, Adler's been having a domestic about realizing he's reliving the same few days over and over as they get gradually worse. The key to this descent into madness is inside the book that represents it. It also makes an appearance during the hallucination before Nowhere, this maddening realm of reality-shifting dreams, and before your fight with Falk, where the world has been so deformed and distorted by this bioresonant loop. Signalis also parallels other stories within the book in interesting ways. One of the stories, Demoiselle D, tells the tale of tragic love as a result of time travel. A man wakes up in the past, falls in love with a falconer huntswoman, but after getting bitten by a snake, wakes back up in the present only to find his love is dead. This is broadly similar to Elster's story. Once upon a time she fell in love with Ariane, but after succumbing to radiation poisoning, similar to how the man succumbs to snake venom, she wakes up in the present without her love. With how the replica frame is just a host for the emergent entity of Elster, the collage of memories, sentiments and feelings that embody her, she is a time traveller in a similar sense. The body is different, but the being, the essence, is the same. Another one of the stories, The Mask, is eerily evocative of the game in description alone. It's described as a dream story of art, love and uncanny science. Signalis encapsulates all of these. We see many classic art pieces of the Island of the Dead, we are beholden to the love between Ariane and Elster, and bioresonant technology, as well as the replica frame itself, can be described as uncanny, all of these shifting and merging in a nonsensical manner, like a dream. Like a place you once loved, barely remembered, corridors and hallways attaching in an arrangement that makes little to no sense. It also makes mention of a love triangle which exists within Signalis in a less literal sense. Elster and Falk weren't the original replica that fell in love with Ariane, but they both have the same memories as a result of their severe persona degradation. Both of them, at the end, are fighting each other to be Ariane's betrothed, to have the exclusivity of that love as their own. It's like how Boris and Alec are competing for Genevieve's love, the damsel in the story who fell sick from a mysterious fever and, after drowning, is left as a marble sculpture lying in the house she perished within. Just how Ariane was left frozen within the ship she slowly began to die in also. The stranger, described as the focal character of the play, can be likened to Elster. She arrives in a place where hardly anyone knows her, and she is quite literally the audience's focal point, not to mention it's through her serving as the audience's perspective that we descend further into insanity. But interestingly, I think this may apply even more so to Adler. During a cutscene following Elster's descent into Rotfront, Adler kisses the slumbering Falk on the forehead as his biocomponents rot and overtake him. A line saying, "I wear no mask and I hate everything," appears on screen. Wouldn't you know, in an excerpt of a play in the book, the stranger says that very same opening line, "I wear no mask." This is a reference to the pallid mask, the object that serves the will of the King in Yellow, and how it is not something they can just remove like the others have. Adler, in that moment, has revealed his true face, something he can't just remove. The stranger is a servant of madness, fitting for the only replica in the facility to have noticed the cyclical nature of their existence in S23. But if you're not one for all that subliminal messaging, subtext media analysis that nerds online do, there's something far more direct here. Adler's name is Yellow, the only replica to ever have this colour. Now, this may sound ridiculous, but maybe this is a deliberate reference to a certain monarch of a particular shade. I think the King in Yellow's repeated presence within Signalis, as well as references in the structure of the premise on top of specific lines like Adler's, means one thing. Signalis is a King in Yellow short story. It's an addition to this anthology of maddening impossibilities, another tale in the lineup of tragedies that comprise this book, set far in humanity's future. When so many of the broad strokes can be reasonably attributed to inspiration from Chambers' work, it seems unfair to regard The King in Yellow as just a referential piece. And that's fitting, isn't it? For something intended to be a King in Yellow short story to be so potently maddening for those who have played it, to be as ensnaring as the play is shown to be in the book. Voice Quills on Twitter has been on the front lines of despaired brain rot following beating the game since early January. You know, funny story, I actually tried to get her to do some VA work for this video. It paid, of course. I don't even have the necessary exposure to cheapskate creatives with. She never got back to me. She's very busy, and understandably so. I think someone said that she was busy, like, making a chicken sandwich or something. But that's not the only piece of classical established art Signalis uses excellently as a point of symbolism. The Island of the Dead painting makes numerous appearances during the game, both in auto-injector acid trips and in paintings found throughout what we assume to be the real world. The art piece by Arnold Böcklin, a Swiss painter, depicts a lonely island in the middle of a vast sea, being visited by a small boat. On this boat are two people and a draped coffin. According to an article by the Met Museum, this was originally commissioned by a patron of Mr. Böcklin as a memorial to her deceased husband. The oil on wood piece would be remade 3 additional times by Böcklin and would become the subject of inspiration for many other artists who would try their hand at replicating the work with their own twist. But what is the painting's relevance to the game as symbolism? Good question. The audio given from this article describes Böcklin's work as having been differentiated from the Impressionist artists of the time by how Böcklin established his paintings in dreamlike settings and environments. We already understand Rose Engine are quite fond of dreams, so of course this already feels like a deliberate choice. However, the implementation goes beyond a simple game of association with a single word. During the fake ending, the Island of the Dead's many iterations are shown on screen. It also starts to flash inside Elster's body as she attempts to open the ship. Before we arrive in Nowhere, we walk along a beach with dark tides coming in, a similar scene to one of Ariane's coastal paintings. However, after the flashback to Ariane, we find ourselves back there once more. Many cryptic notes lie scattered across the shore. The first talks of something older than humanity sleeping deep below, an ocean of memories only a select few people, the bioresonant folk, can hear calling to them, where the self ends and the collective begins. The second has a Lovecraft quote, followed by the phrase, "Only through death can I escape the call of the one who rules above all life." The third is slightly more to the point. Just after this, we step aboard a boat and start to ferry ourselves across the water. A boat that looks rather similar to a certain painting's maritime craft, don't you think? Knowing what we know now about Elster's true intentions, it's clear the Island of the Dead is representative of their final destination. Elster is the ferryman that must take Ariane across the water to the afterlife. It appearing inside Elster in the fake ending also represents how death is claiming her also, or how maybe it's becoming an increasingly irresistible desire as she realizes she cannot enter. The use of the Island of the Dead for this works well for 2 reasons. The first is an observation pointed out to me by my main man Raz Tasva on YouTube, something I never even stopped to consider. Why would a society that deplores artistic expression have a painting like this, an established piece of classical art? Well, to answer that question with a question, would such a society have made anything in the many years of its reign to display? A culture bearing such hostility to creative endeavour has nothing to show for itself. All they have is a painting from the late 1800s to take its place, if not the numerous propaganda posters. So, in the world, there's a reasonable context. The symbol is believably present. The second reason, though, is the origin of Elster's brain scan. During the fake ending, we also get shots of a Venetan front, as well as a specific soldier we only see a photo of in a rot front photo store, Lilith Ito. She's never mentioned by Issa and sparingly shown in Signalis, but her presence alone, however brief, is deliberate. We know Elster has a Venetan accent, and we know her brain scan was taken from a neural archive destroyed during the planetary bombardment of Veneta. The file on her confirms it was taken specifically from a Venetan soldier, which explains the fondness and familiarity for firearms in the written sections of inspected weapons and ammo. Lilith Ito, as part of the Ito family, is Venetan. There is an implied connection between Elster and Lilith, that maybe the destroyed brain scan of the original template may have belonged to her, a woman we hardly ever see in the game, which may be the result of the nation removing all record of her existence. All that remains is a photo someone took and sent off before Yusan had a chance to scrub everything clean. More concrete, however, is how the game uses similar poses and art to indirectly inform the audience of links between them. At the end of the game, we see a note talking about how the woman in the photo, Alina CO, is very similar to Ariane in hers. Lilith is on the left in the original. Well, if Ariane is the one on the right, a girl we know to be completely alone barring one certain replica, who else is going to be on the left? Elster, surely. The photo, however, is blacked out when we find it. But this isn't the only time Elster occupies a similar pose. Lilith is missing her right eye. Guess who gets their right eye gouged out by Adler? Both of them have the exact same pose for after the wound was inflicted upon them also. If the game makes use of this technique to establish Ariane and Alina are similar, it stands to reason Signalis is also implying Lilith and Elster are the same. The emergent entity is Lilith Ito. That's likely why Elster, at first, is so determined to find Alina in S23. Lilith and her likely had some sort of relationship, something very gay if this game is anything to go by. But because Ariane loves Elster so much and looks so similar to Alina, Elster comes to care for Ariane equally enough to suffer through the hell of the game once she starts to remember her. She couldn't save Alina, so maybe saving Ariane is a form of redemption for Lilith. How else could Elster immediately recognize Issa before she gives her name? Because she's her older sibling. Or rather, was. Lilith's fate is never revealed, so it's up to speculation whether she was alive somewhere else across the solar system, or tragically perished during the bombing of Veneta. And this is how the Island of the Dead's use ties in so well. Veneta is a planet that's surface is completely covered by the ocean, with high-rises and buildings built upon floating platforms. The Island of the Dead is also floating on an endless expanse of water. The line that falls from the sky during the ferry ride signifies the dropping of the nuclear barrage, killing everyone. We see it in one of the images during the fake ending. The Island of the Dead is a really fitting symbol to represent the fatal nature of the promise, and, in a bittersweet way, escape. A natural paradise for these two to become recluses together and shelter away from the terrible world. Because that's what one of the notes talks about on that beach, escaping the call of the one who rules above all life. What does that mean? Dear viewer, you will be delighted to know that I, as always, have the answer. A colour frequently associated with these sequences, as well as the Island of the Dead, is red. This vivid shade evoking violent, bloody, and desperate imagery makes repeated appearances throughout Signalis, especially during moments of saving the game. Red appears a lot in conjunction with the Island of the Dead, like the key painting puzzle during the Protector's dorm and part of the flashing hallucinations during the fake ending. Not to mention is found in ridiculous abundance beyond the gate. It's simple. Red represents death, the final destination. In the Promise ending, the entire room is bathed in a soft red glow, but for the other two endings where you don't kill Ariane, everything is blue. It's a more peaceful colour, less intense, but it is a sadder shade. Miserable, riddled with regret, immobilized by despair. A hue of emotion congregating around the realization, Elster can't do it. She can't bring herself to honour that oath. Blue also gets shown on the death screen. This Elster has died, and well, that kind of relieves her of her duties, doesn't it? Death is the ultimate way to skip out life's responsibilities, the best way to stall and stagnate on carrying out a promise you are terrified of fulfilling. I think this answers that question mark. Red represents death and deliverance, blue represents disquiet, peace and suffering, and ultimately this note is talking about escaping into the oblivion of one's own demise. That the realm of death far below is something that predates humanity, a collective of tortured souls joined together in gruesome flesh to escape the persecution of life. This is why I find their imagery of nowhere to make sense despite generic origins. Death is gruesome, it's ugly and grotesque and provokes a primitive desire to flee in the face of it, but it's ultimately the only way to be free, to be liberated from this world. That's why Elster's chest piece is that same vivid shade. Death is her duty, her oath, and it is both her titanium shell and emergent entity. She is deathward, always plunging further, to spare her love excruciating suffering. But who? Who are we fleeing from? Who is the one that reigns over all life that does so with such despotic hatred of all, that we yearn for the conclusion to everything? The Red Eye. The red eye is specifically brought up during the Rotfront chapter, found in this book nestled in a back alley, a folklore tale as a result of pareidolia, a habit to see meaningful images in random patterns. The red eye in reality is an anticyclonic storm caused by the planet's atmospheric pressure, but was seen as a symbol of struggle. It became synonymous with the inescapable surveillance of the protectors and Haymat's stringent control emanating from its central government, an unblinking, watchful eye that observes all without failure. Traditions to honour those who died during the revolution may supposedly be founded in this deity's imagery, as the red coins share an uncanny resemblance with the ever-vigilant overseer. This mention of pareidolia becomes a solution to the butterfly puzzle by seeing letters on the insect wings, which is a cool intersection of world building and game implications. But more importantly, this answers the question: who was Ariane trying to escape? A citizen who was raised on Rotfront and lived somewhere they would have a clear view of these anticyclonic storms in the sky? Well, she says so in her own entry log.
When I first signed up for this mission, I just wanted to get away from everything. I was sick of Rotfront, of school, of the photo store, sick of the fake smiles and the whispering behind people's backs. When I saw that photo of that soldier, I wondered who she was. Was she happy? Was her family proud of her? Did her comrades love her? Since we looked alike, could I have been like her? But in the end, I just wanted to leave. Nothing I had done or made ever meant anything to anyone, so why bother? And here, I'm finally free. I get to be myself and do what I want. I can finally be happy.
Now, I've heard in passing, on Twitter and Discord, that some people think the Red Eye is Ariane. The Red Eye is the one to infect Falk with these memories, and Ariane quite literally has red eyes. There's also a panning shot to the Red Eye during the artifact ending, which seems to suggest some sort of relationship. It is plausible as a symbolistic representation of where this infection of envy, of regret and self-hatred as a result of a life you couldn't have, originates from. Yet it seems, to my superior intellect at least, that it fits this better. The Red Eye, the thing that rules over life as she has known it to, is Yusan's will enforced by the protectors. Ariane pursued the Penrose project not out of perceived dutiful obligation to her country or fellow people, not out of a desire to be at the forefront of a new era for Yusan, but because she wanted to escape what had so much control over her life. The nation, in all its hatred of individualistic expression and artistic endeavour, was the antithesis to Ariane Yong's essence. She couldn't be who she truly was. How can you when you're just a rank-and-file worker who could only ever achieve greatness through dying on some front line as a martyr of inescapable authoritarianism? How can you when you're seen as lesser than the machines that exist to work, die, and be replaced? She didn't want to be a citizen of a regime that saw the humanity of the person as needless and superfluous baggage, as something that got in the way of their true vision of life. A vision where everyone, gestalt and the machine servants grafted from their humanity, only live to work, to be a cog, essential to the machine's operation only for a short window before another component, better, stronger, more efficient, would take her place. Rotfront was never free from the scrutinizing glare of a red eye, was never without snide comments made at the expense of her happiness, and it was because of that she could never feel at home there. It wasn't living. Not under that intense gaze of fierce red, a colour repeatedly established to be associated with death, decay, and blending into the grotesque collective, where you are just a sum of your parts, where your identity and dignity are gone, and you can only be considered as a component of something horrific, disgusting, and monstrous. That's the parallel. A life like this is death without dying. To be a good servant of Yusan is to feel like you're slowly wasting away, unhappy and miserable, ultimately deprived of hope. This is how the mysterious disease wiped out S-23 so quickly. Life in Yusan is so hopeless, so devoid of happiness and purpose, that when Falk began irradiating the facility with these memories of joy and love, it ruined everyone. Why do Issa, Ariane, and Alina all occupy this similar pose? We know the game has a habit of using this technique to suggest characters look familiar or are the same. I think here it's being used in a different way. These three are in this same pose because they all have that same moment of hopeless realization. Alina in the elevator, doomed to forever serve S23. Ariane on the Penrose, trapped as she's always been, realizing that there never was a way out. Issa realizing Erica is dead, as implied by the death tarot card next to her portrait, and she will never be able to reunite with her. In this moment of complete hopelessness, in realizing there is no more, the disease immediately kills Issa. Is it any surprise other Gestalt, who only know endless work broken up to satisfy basic physical needs, died almost instantly to this fast-spreading disease? Is it any surprise the replicas, who one day will be executed for inevitable inefficiency, abandoned their obligations and turned feral towards everything around them? It's fitting that this disease melts away the machine's visage of humanity, leaves them as nothing but the frame manufactured by their oppressive overseers, and all that's left are overgrown biocomponents, ugly, desperate, irrational distortions of components we associate with the inner being, the place of human emotion and soul, compelling these machines into violent acts of manic desperation. There's a line during the descent into the dorms that says, "None of us are here by choice. S23 is a horrific nightmare. No sane person would want to be here." Issa and Elster dare to continue braving the depths because the obligation of their love for family and partner compels them to do so. And when hope is gone, there is no desire to continue. Why else does Adler's body become overridden with biocomponents as he comes to despise everything around him? Why else does this happen to Falk when she realizes Ariane will never be hers, this girl she had never met who brought her so much joy? Why else does Elster die as soon as she realizes it's over, that there is nothing else left for her? You opt in for the bliss of nothingness and expire. If not become so overridden with scorned hatred, you kill everything that moves. This is what makes Signalis such an enthralling, intoxicating, and mesmerizing work. Yusan, as an authoritarian regime, refuses to see the value of the individual at the cost of everyone. The self is given zero regard. You are expendable, replaceable, and forgettable. But Elster, despite being a direct product of this despotic government, despite being an entity crafted in the image of the worthless Gestalt worker, stood against that. No more than a bundle of a dead woman's synaptic activity encased in a titanium shell, she forsook the collective, the combined whole that eclipsed the human spirit, and endured unfathomable and unintelligible atrocities to do something for herself. She fights Falk, a replica model designed in the likeness of a great revolutionary, the figurehead of Yusan's might, in pursuit of the self. To do something for someone she loved once upon a time, stranded amidst the aftermath of their love. Elster's selfishness, as justified as I find it to be, does come at the cost of everything. To cross the threshold once more at the end is to let the cosmic disturbance seep further into reality, to let the dreamer turn over once more and set destruction upon the world, to let it forever distort and destroy not just S23, but the entire planet, if not the foundation of existence. Yusan's brutal policies and philosophies, conceived in a concerted effort to focus all on the well-being of the wider community, even at detriment to the individual, only drove Elster to do the exact opposite, to abandon the dying world constantly at war with itself and love Ariane one last time. To go to the island of the dead together, just like the tarot card of the lovers shows. Signalis being so masterfully done in this way is, in part, due to its place in queer media. It's not stated directly anywhere. For all we know, labels for lesbian and sapphic love don't even exist in this universe, but in true Signalis fashion, this anti-queer oppression can be inferred. Two women, practically exiled from their country for being antithetical to the nation's cultural values, falling in love to spite a world that would never approve of them. A world that left a document telling them to not interact with one another. Queer love, as we unfortunately know in reality, is something frequently prohibited the world over. Something cynically legislated against, something formally declared contraband, something that is not normalized in its right to exist, but instead in its right to be treated as the enemy. Love, queer love, is one of the ultimate ways the self can be expressed. A fond affection between two or more people, a connection that tethers you together, something that is more than just the carnal desire of one's body. Something that cannot be contained by a meticulously constructed frame, something that can't be pruned from the human mind, something that cannot be legislated out of the world. Elster truly loved Ariane. During the keycard puzzle in the medical wing, you have to get 5 keycards. You find the fire card in the incinerator, the air card in the air vent, the water card in the flooded room. But where'd you get the gold card? the card associated with an element used in jewellery because of its beauty, something socially considered to be incredibly valuable and attractive. From a memory of Ariane, Elster adored her, and it's why she always came back to brave a world that wanted to kill Elster just so she could save her love. To free Ariane from the Red Eye. How fitting it is that we play from a top-down perspective, an ever-seeing eye that observes something that was once a proponent of its oppression, and it's only once these two are dead that we see them no longer, that they escaped its gaze. That, in oblivion, they found dignity together. Elster and Ariane are the only two characters who pass without being corrupted or distorted by the disease, because they always had the hope of one another, even in death. Their love is a painful reflection of existence, tapping into the horrible reality of now that we are all unfortunately familiar with. And it's because of this that Signalis is such an affecting tale. The inherent persecution that parallels queer love of the modern era makes it so disturbingly real, and ultimately, sickeningly tragic. Signalis is a story about the self in a world that hates it, about how an obsession with efficiency and productivity obscures what makes life worth living, of how authoritarian regimes that try to deprive you of happiness and self-fulfillment, even in a potentially good-willed attempt to rebuild, estrange humanity from purpose and always set themselves up for collapse. But Signalis is also a story about art, about a society that sees no value in it and considers it contrabanded ideological propaganda. And when art is considered a labour of passion latent with human sentiment, thoughts and emotions, that is a pretty big aspect of the game's overarching philosophy on authoritarianism, on the persecution of self-expression, an aspect that has become especially relevant right now. That's right, I am still not done. Now that we have emerged from the throes of tragedy, misery, and insanity, let us take this ultimate act to a stage of greater stability. Twitter. Social media that can be likened to digital Russian roulette.
Don't worry about it. Fuck.
Recently on Twitter, a fun little game has been making the rounds. Helldivers 2, a badass, bombastic, over-the-top and ridiculously fun co-op shooter where you participate in a war against bugs and robots as they attempt to encroach upon your sacred, democratic way of life. Consensus seemed to be that it was a blast, and even with the meager few hours I managed to get a hold of, I can absolutely agree. But then I saw this tweet by Mr. JFJ. It's a long one, so feel free to give it a read if you need, but I laser focused on this message at the bottom that culminates the philosophy of the post. Fuck your $70 preachy political garbage, I've got Super Earth. The insinuation of this statement, amidst this wince-worthy sentimental pole polishing about the indomitable human spirit, is that AAA games, the ones that get published at that price anyway, suck because they have politics, whereas Helldivers 2 and games of similar ilk do not suck because they do not have politics. They are the Chad and you are the Soyjack, and this stuck out to me for one main reason. It's completely fucking stupid. Helldivers 2 is a game where, at every possible opportunity, a character is bringing up and invoking democratic values. Their army has democracy officers, fire support will goad the enemy with tasting the sweet glory of freedom whilst dropping airburst rounds on their heads. Helldivers will cry out to liberty when they're injured as if it's a deity. Meanwhile, it is written as part of the lore of this game that Super Earth's political system votes on your behalf based on what it assumes works well for you. Everyone has the exact same house, the exact same car, the exact same clothes, and similar, if not exactly the same haircuts. Super Earth is a liberty-enjoying democratic entity in the same way North Korea is a democratic republic. And, of course, we don't need to interrogate that every single person has an American accent. We don't need to think about what country that also champions democratic rights, whilst also being extremely authoritarian and militaristic, is being paralleled here. There's absolutely no way it's parodying well-established internet jokes about the American military dispensing freedom through complete destruction and treating civilian casualties as a high score to beat. It's over the top and ridiculous and played deliberately to comedic effect with little stake in gameplay, but when considering the deliberate nature of game design, this is intentional political commentary. A planet that champions democracy and professes its love of democracy, all the while enforcing an actually undemocratic system whilst shooting, bombing and gassing foes for their natural resources, is purposeful satire. This isn't to say that I don't enjoy the game or that it's wrong for people to have fun with it. It is extremely fun.
Oh, that grenade bounced! Oh my god!
I'm so glad I got that. Nor is it to say that adversaries of Super Earth are exactly the good guys. The Terminids are spiritual cousins of the Tyranids. I don't think I need to elaborate why that makes them quite bad, and the automatons aren't exactly friendly to the idea of diplomacy. There's just something about the glowing red skulls, heavy machine guns, and revving industrial chainsaws called meat saws that tells me the automatons harbour a disregard for the sanctity of life that makes Israel look like a humanitarian aid organisation. But what irked me the most about the flagrant inaccuracy of his dumb post was some of the replies. People insisting that I'm the fun police or I'm trying to make enjoying the game problematic somehow instead of just playing it. That I was getting in the way of fun for other people. When I asked why I couldn't both enjoy and understand the game simultaneously, I was provided a few messages, namely this one, that explained why not. This post is hilarious for two reasons. One, the implicit message is that basic media literacy is something only the Twitter leftists can do, which is, as the youth say, a hell of a self-report. Two, it insinuates the presence of a weird mutually exclusive dichotomy. Either you understand what you play, or you enjoy what you play. You can't do both. This is bizarre, both in conceptualization, because it makes no fucking sense, but also because a significant number of people seemingly agree with it. That it doesn't mean anything because they don't care. And sure, the salience of a piece of media's meaning is reliant on your ability to engage with it, but that doesn't mean it's not there. That means you're willfully ignoring it. AAA games aren't bad because they're always getting on a soapbox, they're bad because they're not made well. How fucking ironic for guys claiming I'm reading too far into basic subtext or creating rocket science out of blatant and obvious mainstream mediocrity. But why have I brought this up? Am I trying to vindicate myself in a Twitter argument that left me upset and frustrated? Absolutely yes. But also because I think it coincidentally is extremely relevant to the topic of discussion. I'm not picking on JFJ because I want to beef a YouTuber who could crush me like a fly, God knows I need to do that again, but because this post's implicit message is that games, and arguably media as a whole, have suffered because they mean something. That the folly of art has been it's not just spectacle. That Helldivers 2 sets an example where games need to relinquish deeper meaning and focus again on being spectacle. That a game like SIGNALIS is doing it wrong. And that, to me, was what truly made me dislike this post. We are living in a time where art, creative efforts, and overall endeavours across many mediums are under siege by mainstream industry, where increasingly passionate creative projects are being viewed solely through the lens of how much money they can bring in, the potential for merch and sequels and spin-offs, the traction they'll get online, and other soul-crushing criteria that eclipses the truly resonant and remarkable aspects of pieces of creative work. The assertion AAA games are bad because they're too political and preachy is purely a product of JFJ's nonsensical bias that, unfortunately, I think a lot of gamers share. AAA games thrive off a broad mass market appeal, of making the same thing with barely reasonable alterations to justify a new price tag every 2 years, and famously depicting controversial things in a story or having characters that aren't cisgender or straight affects sales. People wrote off Starfield for having one dialogue box to pick a fucking word. How many people do you think would be okay with a character being gay? Also, ask yourself how many people attributed its failure to this one box and not the more reasonable reality that it's an uninteresting, poorly written game. It is in the interest of the wallet to make things that don't have meaning, and that is why so many of the top AAA game franchises you know now are exactly that. Maybe once upon a time they meant something, but now they're at the whim of profit incentives' heat-seeking nature. And look, this isn't a bad thing as a concept. There's nothing wrong with enjoying casual experiences, or games whose worth is measured purely through play and entertainment and nothing else. Helldivers 2 is a casual game, and it's still fantastic because, again, it was made well. Chivalry 2 is an active simulation of chainsaw sodomy, yet I find its dual servers extremely rewarding to play, both for competitive reasons and for spectating the local specimens in chat. Look at this guy, he is yapping up a storm. Not every piece of media is a complex puzzle like SIGNALIS, and I don't want them to have to be. That would only serve to make SIGNALIS the monotonous norm and cause every developer to go insane during development. But when I see such a vast number of people who seem scorned by the idea that media can mean things, by the concepts of art being products of a time they were conceived in, that they may reflect or challenge attitudes of a period intentionally or otherwise, that sucks. That really sucks. That some people may look at SIGNALIS and call it preachy because they're upset it's not something completely different. That it's just one of those pretentious artsy games with no thought behind it beyond trying to appear unique. That they think to respect something enough to peer closer and postulate its meaning beyond the literal is ostentatious and insufferable. That they're mad it's not something lesser. And it speaks to how art, and consequently the work that goes into it, is getting devalued and almost detested in the same way Signalis' world sees it as a trivial pursuit. Palworld's release led to this infamous clip of the Roach Man saying how it didn't matter that Palworld made use of AI art technology because he had fun. He, the consumer, was satisfied. It was convenient to him and his time, so, as he puts it, artists' opinions don't matter. Whether Palworld did use predatory technology is beside the point. The potential that it did gave rise to this knee-jerk response that is reflective of a troublingly prevalent perspective. Art is something to be consumed solely for simple and temporary entertainment, and then it is to be disposed of. Ignored, not pondered beyond its runtime. No thought given to the act of creation, only to the act of consumption. Not everything has to be Spec Ops The Line, but when the prevailing attitude is that games need to mean less, for when idiots like JFJ and Asmongold profess to be the solution to a stagnating industry, I genuinely start to get anxious about what direction mainstream creative industries are being encouraged to start pursuing. Mainstream creative industries that already don't see art more than the value of its profits. And you have to understand how much of a fucking backhand it was to scroll for this clip, struggle to find anything that wasn't just 240p, and instead find a video from Asmon talking about how soulless the AAA gaming industry is now, while saying things that directly speak to its current soulless philosophy to justify playing something that potentially used predatory tech that inherently does not value the work, time, or consent of artists. Oh, you can't find the moral line to discern AI art from regular art? I think it would be more prudent that you find a clothing line to hang up that filthy fucking laundry. We are witnessing a cultural shift where art is increasingly being viewed solely to serve as a product, being forced into the box of mass market appeal, where it has to be vapid spectacle, where meaning and salience is fat to be trimmed, where everything has to be milked dry as franchises and series and multiverses and cinematic universes and spin-offs and sponsorship deals with zero regard for integrity, the work's meaning, or even the people who made it. Disco Elysium is one of the best written games of the last decade, likely even this decade, yet the greedy mitts of the industry have ripped it apart at the seams. The people who created it at Zaum are gone. The planned sequels, dead in the water. The creators of Disco Elysium getting canned by their own CEO, who allegedly illegally manipulated shareholder values to get a majority share and evict them from their own company, a game about corporate greed within the conflict of a union versus the rich logistics companies they work for, is so on the nose it should be considered grievous bodily harm. This is a consequence of not caring about the opinions of artists. They can make brilliant things, and then the people with all the money can push them out of their own creations and take all the profits. It is an industry paradigm to take great ideas motivated by a desire to make something great and rearrange them into mediocre ideas anatomically purposed to maximize profit whilst pushing the creators out of the picture. From the pessimistic, heartless, and apathetic perspective of maximizing cash flow first and foremost instead of it being the natural outcome of making something good. AAA games suck because they increasingly try to not mean anything in pursuit of a more consistent and secure revenue stream. They have to be empty spectacle, because empty spectacle, on the merit of its silence, alienates the fewest people from the potential consumer base. And if this is how work gets valued, creations latent with the mess of feeling and sentiment, how can we be surprised those who made it get seen as worth even less? Is it any wonder Bethesda saw it fit to withhold transgender woman Leona Farron's entitled healthcare in an effort to coerce her into silence for how she was treated at the company? Is it any shock that this work environment increasingly sees its creatives as just liabilities? This section has been so unbelievably infuriating to write, more so than any other, because every time I think I'm done, when I think it can't get any worse and I can be liberated from making this video, it does. Something else appears that decides to up the ante on financially motivated apathy towards creative work. A bunch of games, like the beloved Duck game, are getting delisted because Warner Bros. Have consumed the publisher and are axing all the titles to cut costs, not from the sizable paychecks of their leadership of course, but the already impoverished pockets of the game creators who are being robbed of the autonomy over their own creations. This is what an industry that doesn't think art means anything looks like. Different brands and businesses racing to innovate how efficiently they can rob creators of their lovingly made art and monetize it, all the while complete morons whose only contribution to the world is consuming other people's work, morons with tons of money and influence that shields them from ever experiencing this vulnerability, are egging it on to go even further. It's not enough to completely ruin the careers and livelihoods of these artists. Multi-billion-dollar corporations should be able to pick artists scientists at random take their brain and store them in jars to siphon their ideas into industrial storage tanks to best benefit the consumer. No longer are these people the visionaries who make our entertainment possible, who ought to be fairly compensated for their diligent work. Now they're just seen as expenditure to be optimized out of a model. And why would businesses ever shift from this framework, risking tons of money on new ideas when they can just hunker down on what they know works with minimal changes every time, charge you a premium rate for it, and then charge you even more for things that should have come with the game already? And in a world filled with creatives, on this online plane filled with artists and musicians and writers and game designers and video editors and blender animators and voice actors, I increasingly, as one of them, feel like I am nothing. I sometimes feel stranded in this worthlessness, this expendability, that the things I make, the things I put the limited and invaluable currency of precious seconds, minutes, days, weeks, years into, are being seen as just a distraction, a pacifier, a product, a price tag, and a time commitment. I feel like I'm going insane when I see people echoing these apathetic talking points about the convenience of a consumer, that ethical creative practice doesn't matter if it was fun for a bit, that the people who have no idea of the burden of creativity, the anxious, maddening, gnawing burden of making something and praying it's good, of putting an earnest piece of yourself in the firing line, get to fucking dictate how we ought to do it. People who see the journey as the inconvenience, as not optimal, as inefficient. People who think art is just about what's made and not what was part of making. People who see those seconds, minutes, days, weeks, and years as a waste of time. People who view art as a product and not as a love. So when I played SIGNALIS, it didn't just affect me as a game. It didn't just enthrall me as a story. It didn't just madden me with the obsession of its world and society and the replica and rotfront, beautifully cramped and chaotic rotfront. It ruined me as a sentiment on art. I looked at a piece of work so lovingly put together, each and every thread woven by a pair of creators who adore what they're making enough to persist through the inevitable difficulties they faced, and I wanted to cry. I wanted to cry then and now, because I had played something that respected itself for what it was. That it was something meaningful, something that beckoned my pondering mind, a beautiful collage of a creator's thoughts and feelings and perspectives and philosophies embedded in an inviting universe, in tragic characters, and a horror that only dawns on you when you look beyond the screen. A world that sees art as nothing, art as inefficient, unoptimized, and futile pursuits that can only distract one for a while, ends up like this. A world that subjects those with an affinity to create to horrible crunch, to unreasonable deadlines, to canning their ideas that mean something and forcing them to work on things that are soullessly profitable, if not outright pushing them away from their own work. A world where consuming is all, where consuming is more important than creating. It propagates a view that efficiency is everything, that productivity is everything, that all we're good for is work, and we all end up wishing we were dead to escape it. You want to know why indie games are so often smash successes? Because these creators with no investors or marketing teams or millions upon millions of dollars backing them realize that they have a slim chance of making it, so they may as well make what they love. Unshackled by the constraints of business, unfettered by the concerns of a wallet beyond being rewarded for their hard work, these people who love what they're doing, who love what they're making, create because they believe in it. Because to them, art is as much about the money as it is staying sane in a world that increasingly refuses to value it and its creators. When I look at Rose Engine's magnum opus, the earmarkings of this affection for the creative process are there. They're vested in the details of the world and the story, they're found in the researched and thought out references to similar media, they're left within the considerations given for design, play, and narrative. Something made to make money would not have been so thorough, would not dare to have required so much of the player, and would have made many compromises to appeal to more people at the cost of the game. One of those concessions may have very well been its place as queer media, the irrefutably passionate devotion of oneself to another that has spoken to so many of SIGNALIS' players. These sorts of things aren't reliably profitable, so, unfortunately, it would be one of the first things up on the chopping block. Fortunately, SIGNALIS didn't have to do that. It understood that it had a target audience, it understood it couldn't appeal to everyone, and it played to its own strengths to be the best it could for the people who would enjoy it. How refreshing to finally have a game that is happy with being amazing and fondly remembered for a specific audience, instead of being mediocre and forgotten by everyone in 10 minutes. How refreshing they didn't compromise the integrity of their own story for extra sales on release, because to Rose Engine and many other creators of their ilk, it meant something. It had meaning not just in its subtext, but in its own existence as a piece of art, as a piece of earnest individual expression. And that really just doesn't have a price tag. As of now, I'm really happy to say SIGNALIS is a well-regarded cult classic. It won the Best Indie Horror and Best Narrative in the 2023 Horror Game Awards. Health dedicated their song Don't Try to the game in a recently released music video, which is high praise to get fellow artists to do that. I always thought their song Tears for Max Payne 3 was extremely fitting for SIGNALIS anyway. I almost feel vindicated seeing them officially attach themselves to it. SIGNALIS now has a multiplayer mod, in beta I believe, which is being worked on by Christopher Beast and a handful of other people. I've linked their channel below if you'd like to take a look. And SIGNALIS continues to spread its sickening, life-altering disease to many more victims, and I'm all here for it. Stedalnik, one of my favourite anthro artists of all time, recently started drawing SIGNALIS. Having an artist I admire and respect engage with media by other artists I like and respect is a fantastic union of great minds that fills me with indefatigable vindication. Creators of Peak coming together to enjoy Peak. It makes my day to see that SIGNALIS is so adored. It makes me feel happy knowing something so unapologetically gay is getting popular, something renowned for its merits of storytelling, getting to finally see something in the spotlight that is there because it deserves to be, not because it flashed enough cash to insert itself as a YouTube ad. But it's become the subject of many art pieces and animations and has brought about a community of wonderfully queer people that share their own creations and ideas they may one day pursue. I shared a conversation with someone months ago in SIGNALIS Cord about a prospective idea they had for a survival horror game, and I was really happy they found my contributions to be insightful. And that's the goal, isn't it? Circulating that desire to just make something, to get it out of your system. For the longest time after SIGNALIS, I was stuck as a writer. I was wondering how I could be like Rose Engine, how I could make something so similarly subtle yet discernible. And I started to feel I could never make something like that. I felt defeated. I felt like it wasn't worth doing anymore. But that wasn't the point. That's never the point. SIGNALIS' success as a piece of art, as a creation of integrity and love, does not exist to stifle others. It exists to encourage people to don a similar attitude to different creations, to find a similar affection for the act of making, to apply themselves to creative endeavour, and to let it be the springboard for pursuing the arts further. So I drew, and I wrote, and I made this video, and I felt so genuinely happy to be making something, spurred on by SIGNALIS. Do away with thoughts of commercial success. Concern yourself not with the dollars and coins that we've come to associate as making art worthwhile, and just fucking make something. Fuck these people saying it's meaningless, fuck these people saying the consumer comes first, and fuck compromising the vision for a few extra bucks. Make something you can look back on and be happy you did, whether it makes millions or it makes pennies. We were drawing on the walls of caves for the fun of it a long time before money was even a thought. SIGNALIS is a game I'll never forget. SIGNALIS is a name I'll cherish. SIGNALIS is something I'll hate and scorn and curse for the obsession it's bestowed upon me and how I feel like I'm freebasing the chemical composition of sheer delirium. And forever adore for how it redefined my perspective on making, on this act of humanity, of sanity, in an increasingly inhumane and insane world. SIGNALIS is a word synonymous with a love for art, synonymous with the thought that the catharsis of creation alone makes it all worthwhile. This is how SIGNALIS ruined my life in the best possible way.